They thought they were just being adventurous, a group of 7 friends taking a harmless detour to a secret swimming spot deep in the New Zealand forest. They heard the warning siren not once, but 3 times. But they didn't understand it. And that one mistake, mistaking danger for something harmless, would turn a perfect day into a fight for survival against a wall of water they never saw coming. But to understand how 7 smart, careful young people ended up in that situation, we need to go back just a few hours earlier. On the morning of Monday, the 6th of February 2017, the air in New Zealand was thick with the lazy, happy feeling of a national holiday. For a tight-knit group of 7 college friends, it was the perfect end to a perfect weekend. They were just starting to stir, packing up their cars to make the 3-hour drive from the scenic area around Lake Tekapo back to the bustling city of Auckland, where their regular lives were waiting for them. The night before had been a blast. They'd been to a huge concert on the lake called Flocella. The whole concept was pretty cool. Everyone was out on the water on these big inflatable rafts and floats, listening to music under the open sky. It was one of those memorable nights that define your youth. After the concert wrapped up, they didn't go wild. They headed to a nearby relative's house, had a quiet little after party with a couple of drinks, and everyone was in bed a little after midnight. They were responsible, just a group of good friends enjoying their time together. This particular morning, the plan was to get up early and hit the road. February 6th is Waitangi Day in New Zealand, a major public holiday, and they knew the roads back to Auckland would be jammed with traffic if they didn't get a head start. So they were up, packing their bags, cleaning up, the familiar routine of ending a trip. They had 3 cars between the 7 of them, and just as they finished loading the last of their things, right when they were about to get in and start the engines, one of the friends piped up with an idea. Her name was Rachel de Jong. She was 21 years old, full of life, and the kind of person who was always looking for a little bit of adventure. Rachel suggested they take a quick detour before heading straight home. She told the group that she and another friend in the group, a girl named Maddie, had found out about this incredible secret swimming spot. It was only about 15 minutes away from where they were, and better yet, it was basically right on their way back to Auckland. She described it as this beautiful, secluded pool of green-blue water tucked away in the middle of a forest. The pool was technically part of the Waikato River, but in that specific area, the river was mostly very shallow or completely dry most of the time. This made the pool look like its own isolated, pristine little oasis. It sounded magical. She explained that there wasn't an official marked trail to get to it, which only added to the appeal. Instead, there was a kind of unofficial dirt path that had been worn into the forest floor over the years by locals who knew about the spot. It was their own little secret. The idea was immediately popular. Who wouldn't want to cap off a great weekend with a swim in a secret, beautiful spot? It was spontaneous and adventurous. The decision was unanimous. Everyone piled into the 3 cars, a small convoy of friends, ready for one last bit of fun before returning to reality. By around 11:40 inches the morning, with Rachel and Maddie giving directions, they found the spot. It was just like Rachel had described. A winding main road, and right off the side of it, the subtle beginning of a dirt trail leading into the woods. They carefully pulled their cars over, making sure they were safely off the road, and the 7 of them got out. The air was fresh and clean. Rachel and Maddie led the way, and the group disappeared into the trees, following the narrow path. The walk was easy, and they were all chatting and laughing, excited about the swim. About 15 minutes into their hike, at exactly 11:55 a.m., they could tell they were getting close. Up ahead, the dense canopy of trees was starting to thin out, a sure sign that they were approaching a clearing or a body of water. But then, something strange happened. The group suddenly stopped in their tracks. From somewhere out in the forest, way off in front of them, a loud, shrill siren sound cut through the peace and quiet. It was high-pitched and piercing. It blared on for what felt like a long time, maybe 20 or 30 seconds, and then it just stopped. The silence that followed felt heavy. The seven friends just stood there on the trail, looking around and then at each other with confused expressions. No one had any idea what it could be. An ambulance? A fire truck? It didn't make any sense. They were deep in a forest, far from any town. There were no houses or buildings nearby. After a moment of collective uncertainty, they just kind of shrugged. It was weird, for sure, but there was no obvious sign of danger. So, they chalked it up to a mystery and kept walking, their excitement for the swimming hole quickly pushing the strange noise out of their minds. Within another minute, they had reached the end of the trail. And the view was worth it. They were standing at the edge of a beautiful overlook, looking down at the pool they had come for. It was just as stunning as Rachel had promised. To get down to the water, they had to climb down some rocks, but someone had installed some ropes to make it easier and safer. One by one, they made their way down to the edge of the pool. Once they were all down, they stripped off their outer layers, revealing their bathing suits underneath, and wasted no time jumping into the cool, refreshing water. It felt amazing. Out in the middle of the pool, two large rocks jutted up out of the water like a pair of miniature islands. That became their goal. Rachel and the other four women in the group swam out and climbed onto one of the rocks. The two men in the group climbed onto the other. They sat there, basking in the sun, taking in the incredible scenery. It was a perfect, peaceful moment. They felt like they had the whole world to themselves. Then, at 11:58 a.m., it happened again. The same loud, piercing siren blasted across the forest. It was the exact same sound they had heard just 3 minutes earlier while they were on the trail. Once again, all seven of them looked around, and at each other, a bit puzzled. What was this siren all about? But just like before, after the siren went on for about 30 seconds and then stopped, they looked around and saw nothing. There was no smoke, no sign of any emergency, no one else around. The place still looked like a peaceful oasis. So, before long, they forgot about it again. The moment was too perfect to let a weird noise ruin it. Rachel got out her camera and started taking pictures, and others were doing the same, capturing the memory. 2 minutes later, at exactly 12 p.m., the siren sounded for a third time. By this point, the novelty and mystery had worn off. They had heard it twice already, and absolutely nothing had happened. The sound was still jarring, that high-pitched wail really cut through the air, but this time, they barely paid it any attention. It was just a strange, recurring noise. They were laughing and talking, and the siren was just background noise. But when that third siren finally came to a stop, the silence that followed was different. It wasn't quiet. A new sound began to emerge, and this one the group immediately noticed. The sound was coming from the same direction the siren had come from, which was effectively upstream. Even though this part of the river was mostly dry, they could easily see the path the riverbed carved through the landscape, heading uphill and around a bend. So all seven friends turned their heads and looked upstream, listening. The sound was loud, a sort of rumbling, smashing noise. It was getting closer. They exchanged curious and slightly concerned looks with each other, trying to figure out what it could possibly be. And then, all of a sudden, they saw it. A solid white wall of churning water came crashing around the corner of the riverbed up ahead. It was moving incredibly fast, a roaring torrent barreling straight down the dry channel towards them. By the time their brains had even fully processed the impossible sight, the water had reached them. It slammed into their peaceful pool, and the water level began to rise at a terrifying speed. They could literally watch the pool flooding, the water climbing up the rocks they were standing on, higher and higher with each passing second. As the rocks beneath their feet began to submerge, the group had a collective thought. This has to be temporary. Whatever this is, it's going to stop soon. So the initial decision was to just stay put. Hold on, stay on the rocks, and wait it out. They thought they would be okay. But they were wrong. Within seconds, the rocks they were standing on were completely underwater. The torrent was still thundering down the riverbed, filling their pool and then spilling out over the other side, creating a violent, raging rapid where just moments before there had been calm water. They realized with a jolt of panic that if they didn't get off these submerged rocks immediately, they were going to be swept downstream. The two men who were on their own rock acted fast. They saw a rocky outcropping a short distance away that was slightly higher up and, most importantly, was connected to the forest on the bank. That outcropping represented safety. They leaped from their disappearing rock over to it. Once they were securely on it, they turned back and started yelling to the 5 women who were still stranded. They shouted for them to try to swim over, that they would grab them and pull them to safety. But it was an impossible request. By now, the water was rushing past the women's knees with incredible force. They could barely keep their balance just standing still. They knew with absolute certainty that if they tried to swim in that current, they would be gone in an instant, swept away by the raging water. The group quickly realized there was only one option. The women would have to literally jump across the churning water and hope the men could catch them. Rachel de Jong, the one who had suggested this adventure, was the first to try. She took a breath, gathered herself, and leaped off the rock. She reached out, the guys grabbed her arms, and they hauled her onto the rocky ledge to safety. She was safe. She immediately turned around to help. She and the other 2 men now formed a small human chain, their arms outstretched, ready for the next person. At first, the plan seemed to be working. They were managing to get the women across. But then they got down to the second-to-last woman. She made the jump, and she managed to grab one of the guy's arms, but the force of the water and the pull of her weight caused both of them to lose their footing. In a horrifying instant, the man and the woman were both swept off the rocks and into the rapids, disappearing downstream. Panic set in, but Rachel stayed remarkably calm. She moved into the position where the guy had just been, taking his place. She had her GoPro camera on a selfie stick. She quickly extended it all the way out towards the last woman left on the rock, her friend Alice. She yelled for Alice to jump and grab the selfie stick. Alice, who was now almost completely submerged in the raging water, made a frantic, desperate jump. For one heart-stopping second, she managed to grab onto the end of the selfie stick, but her grip slipped. The current was too strong. She was pulled away, and she too began to be swept downstream. And what happened next was a testament to Rachel's character. Rachel, who was completely safe on that rocky ledge, didn't hesitate for a second. She immediately jumped back into the violent rapids after her friend. She managed to grab hold of Alice and tried to turn back, tried to grab onto a rock to stop them both, but she couldn't get a grip. The current was overwhelming. And so, Rachel and Alice were also swept downstream, out of sight. 2 weeks before Rachel and her friends had ever set foot on that dirt trail, a critical warning sign had been stolen. It was a physical sign, and its purpose was to warn people not to go near the river, not to go near that pool. That sign was normally placed right at the very beginning of the unofficial trail, the exact spot where the 7 friends had parked their cars and started their hike. This meant that when they got out of their cars that day, filled with excitement, there was absolutely nothing to tell them about the incredible danger that lay just a 15-minute walk away. Now, it's true that Rachel and Maddie had known about the swimming spot for several months, but it seems they had only heard about it or seen pictures of it. It doesn't appear that they had ever actually walked the trail and been to the pool themselves. If they had, they would have seen the sign. They simply didn't know the terrible secret the place was hiding. The pool itself wasn't the danger. The danger was where the pool was located. It was right in the middle of a dam spillway. About 650 feet upstream from where they were swimming, there is a large hydroelectric dam. And 3 to 4 times every single day, the dam operators open the floodgates. When they do, they release a staggering 20,000 gallons of water per second down the mostly dry riverbed. That water comes careening down the channel, slams into that pool, and continues on its path. The gates stay open for about 15 minutes at a time, and the only reason this is done is for tourism. It's a spectacle designed to show tourists what the riverbed used to look like before the dam was built, back when it was a set of raging natural rapids. On the 6th of February 2017, the dam was scheduled for a spill at exactly 12 p.m. Those sirens the friends heard at 11:55, 11:58, and again at noon were the dam's warning system. They were meant to alert anyone in the area that a spill was imminent. But, of course, the 7 friends had no way of knowing what the sirens meant. To them, it was just a strange, unexplained noise. After the 12 p.m. spill had finally subsided and the water levels returned to normal, the 3 friends who had made it to the safety of the rocky outcropping began a desperate search. 4 of their friends had been swept away by the current. They scrambled down the riverbank, calling out their names. Miraculously, they found them. 3 of the 4 who had been swept away had somehow survived the violent ride downstream. They were battered and bruised, but they were alive. But 1 had not survived. The sole fatality was 2. 1 year, old Rachel DeYoung, the young woman whose idea it was to visit the secret swimming spot in the first place. Rachel, the friend who had already reached safety, but who sacrificed her own life in a heroic attempt to save her friend Alice. Today, if you go to that area of the Waikato River, things look different. There are many more warning signs. There are fences. The warnings are explicit and clear, trying to prevent anyone from making the same mistake. But the dam still operates as it always has. It still spills several times a day for tourists. And despite all the new precautions, despite the widespread media coverage of Rachel's tragic death, people still sneak past the barriers. They still go swimming in that secret pool, drawn by the same beauty that lured Rachel and her friends, either ignorant or uncaring, of the danger that cost a brave young woman her life. Here's the thing about that day in New Zealand. It didn't look dangerous. It didn't feel dangerous. And it definitely didn't sound dangerous, just a strange siren in the distance that no one understood. But that's exactly what made it so deadly. A warning only works if you recognize it for what it is. And for this group of friends, that moment of misunderstanding turned a simple detour into a fight against a force of nature they never even knew was coming. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, sometimes the most dangerous situations don't look dangerous at all until it's too late. Until next time. There is a strange, quiet space that exists at the very edge of human endurance, a place where all of our modern comforts, our safety nets, and our predictable routines are completely stripped away. For most of us, our daily lives are defined by a sense of security. We wake up in our warm beds, we go to work, we buy food at the grocery store, and we assume that the world will continue to make sense. We rarely, if ever, have to contemplate what we would do if our survival was suddenly put on the line. But every once in a while, a single unexpected event can shatter that illusion, thrusting ordinary people into situations so hostile, so extreme, and so terrifying that they seem almost impossible to survive. Today, we are going to explore 3 incredible stories of individuals who were pushed far beyond the limits of physical and mental exhaustion. These are people who found themselves completely alone in some of the most unforgiving environments on our planet, with no help on the way, no food, and absolutely no logical reason to believe they would live to see another day. Yet, in the face of certain death, they did not give up. Instead, they tapped into a deep, primal well of resilience, proving that the human will to survive is one of the most powerful and mysterious forces in existence. Let us begin our journey in the year 1983 on the warm, sun-kissed docks of Tahiti. This is where we meet 23-year-old Tommy Ashcraft. Tommy was a free spirit, a young woman who had fallen in love with the ocean and the ultimate freedom of the sailing lifestyle. She was adventurous, capable, and had spent years learning the complex, demanding art of ocean navigation. It was during her travels that she met 34-year-old Richard Sharp, a seasoned British sailor who shared her deep passion for the sea. The two quickly formed an inseparable bond, united by their shared love of adventure and the open water. They spent more time living on boats than they did on land, dreaming of a future where they would sail around the world together. They were young, they were in love, and they felt entirely invincible. In October of that year, a close friend approached the couple with an incredible opportunity. The friend needed someone to deliver his luxury 44-foot yacht, a vessel named the Hazana, from the tropical waters of Tahiti all the way to San Diego, California. This was a massive undertaking. The journey would cover over 4,000 miles of open, unpredictable ocean. It was a significantly longer and more demanding trip than either Tammy or Richard had ever attempted before. But they were highly confident in their seafaring abilities, and the prospect of spending weeks navigating the deep blue sea together was too exciting to pass up. They gladly accepted the job, packed their gear, and set sail into the vast Pacific. For the first 2 weeks, the voyage was everything they had hoped for. The weather was perfect, the winds were steady, and the Hazana cut through the water with ease. But as they sailed just north of the equator, the ship's weather radio began to crackle with concerning news. A tropical disturbance had formed in the region, and it was rapidly intensifying into a massive hurricane named Raymond. Initially, Tammy and Richard did not panic. They knew that hurricanes in this part of the Pacific often changed direction or weakened before they could cause major damage to a vessel as sturdy as the Hazana. However, they decided that it was still in their best interest to be cautious. They adjusted their sails and altered their course, hoping to sail completely out of the storm's path and find calmer, safer waters. But the ocean had other plans. Over the next couple of days, Hurricane Raymond did not weaken. Instead, it grew into a terrifying Category 4 storm, and its path became highly erratic. Every time Tammy and Richard changed direction to get away from the storm, the hurricane seemed to shift with them, speeding up and closing the distance. It felt as if a massive, malevolent force was actively tracking them across the water. Soon, the sky turned a dark, bruised purple, the wind began to howl with a deafening roar, and the waves grew into towering, foaming walls of water. They realized they could no longer outrun the storm. They were going to have to weather it. They went to work securing the yacht. They put on their heavy, waterproof rain gear, boarded up the cabin windows with thick wooden panels, and double-checked all the safety lines. When they stood on the deck, looking out at the horizon, the scene was absolutely paralyzing. Tammy would later say that she had never truly understood the absolute terror of a hurricane until she was trapped in one. The waves were 50 feet tall, giant walls of black water that lifted the 44-foot yacht into the air, making it completely airborne before sending it crashing down into the deep troughs below. Each time the boat landed, it felt as though the entire structure would break in half. Immediately after each crash, a massive wave would break over the deck, burying the boat in water and threatening to drag them down into the depths. Richard was at the helm, fighting the steering wheel with all his strength. He was an incredibly skilled sailor, and he managed to find a way to ride the waves, steering the boat at just the right angle to prevent it from capsizing. For hours, they fought the storm in a state of absolute chaos. Eventually, the wind began to die down slightly, and the waves, though still massive, became more predictable. It seemed as though they had made it through the worst of the hurricane and that they would survive. At this point, Tommy was completely exhausted. The sheer physical and mental stress of the battle had left her barely able to stand. Richard, who was anchored to the cockpit by a heavy safety line, noticed her fatigue. He told her to go down into the cabin, get some dry clothes, and try to get some rest. He assured her that he had everything under control. Tammy was incredibly grateful. She opened the heavy cabin doors, stepped inside, and made her way down the steps. But just as she reached the bottom of the stairs, she heard Richard scream from the deck. "Oh my God," he yelled. Before Tommy could even react, a massive rogue wave, a towering wall of water that had been hidden by the darkness, struck the Hazana head-on. The force of the impact was so great that it flipped the entire 44-foot yacht completely upside down in a violent backflip. Inside the cabin, Tammy felt the floor instantly vanish. She was thrown violently across the room, her head slamming hard against a wooden cabinet. She was knocked unconscious instantly, and the world went silent. When Tammy finally woke up, 27 hours had passed. She opened her eyes to a scene of absolute devastation. She was lying on the floor of the cabin, partially submerged in cold water. The space was a disaster area. The force of the capsize had shattered the furniture, throwing heavy tools, wet papers, and navigation charts all over the floor. The boat, after being flipped completely upside down, had somehow been rolled upright again by another wave while she lay unconscious. But Tammy's head was throbbing with a severe concussion, and she could barely comprehend where she was or what had happened. Her mind was in a fog, but her survival instincts immediately took over. She knew she had to find Richard. She dragged herself out of the water, climbed the wet, slippery stairs, and pushed open the cabin doors to step out onto the deck. What she saw was a scene of utter horror. The Hazana was completely ruined. Both of the massive masts had snapped off, and the sails were dragging in the water, acting like heavy anchors that were slowly pulling the boat down. The deck had been stripped bare of all equipment. Tommy began to scream Richard's name, her voice cracking with panic, but there was no answer. She rushed to the cockpit where she had last seen him. And then she saw it. Richard's safety line, which had been securely attached to the boat, was dangling over the side of the yacht. She pulled the line up, and her heart shattered. The heavy metal safety harness had actually broken under the immense force of the wave. Richard was gone. He had been swept into the freezing, empty ocean. He was not wearing a life jacket, having taken it off earlier when the storm had briefly calmed down. Tommy was filled with an overwhelming wave of grief. She wanted to sit down and cry, to mourn the loss of the man she loved. But she knew that if she did, she would die too. The boat was slowly sinking. The engine was dead, the radio was ruined by salt water, and the electronic navigation and emergency beacon systems were completely destroyed. She was entirely alone in the very middle of the Pacific Ocean, with no ships, no land, and no hope of rescue. But Tommy refused to give up. She began to act like a robot, focusing entirely on the physical tasks required to survive. She went below deck and began manually pumping the water out of the cabin. She returned to the deck and, using her knowledge of rigging, managed to build a makeshift mast and sail out of the broken debris. She searched the ruined cabin and found that some of the marine almanacs were still dry. By studying the maps, she identifies a major ocean current that she thought she could get to. Using just a sextant and a watch, she manually navigated this broken-down, leaking ship into this current, steering toward Hawaii, which was about 1,500 miles away. For 41 days, Tammy survived on canned food and peanut butter. She manually navigated her ship using only the sun, the stars, the watch, and her sextant. Every single day was a battle against despair. She knew that if her calculations were off by even a fraction of a degree, she would sail past Hawaii and drift out into the endless open waters of the Pacific, where she would run out of food and water and die. But her calculations were flawless. When Tommy finally stepped foot on land in Hawaii, she was relieved that she had made it, but at the same time, she had this sudden flood of emotions. She was so incredibly sad about the loss of Richard. It was like she really had not had a chance to grieve his loss, because that whole time after the accident, her entire focus had been on survival. Although Tammy would make a full recovery, it would take her 6 years to learn how to read again because of the severe head injury she sustained when the boat capsized. But when she did regain that skill, she finally stopped and she wrote her and Richard's story in a book called Red Sky in Morning, which became an international bestseller and was later converted into a movie called Adrift. Now, let us travel from the deep blue waters of the Pacific to the scorching, barren expanse of the Australian outback. This is a place of extreme heat, red dirt, and deadly silence, an environment where a single mistake can easily cost you your life. Growing up in southeastern Australia, Ricky McGee worked a variety of jobs, including being a carpet salesman, a prawn fisherman, a nightclub doorman, an electrician, and a bailiff. In 2006, when Ricky was 35, he was offered yet another new job in a government department in Western Australia. He accepted the job, hopped in his car, and began the long drive across the desert. While on the extremely desolate Buntine Highway, which is basically a road in the middle of the desert with nothing around, no people, no buildings, nothing, he was driving along and he saw a group of 3 men standing outside of their car. Ricky assumed they must have broken down, so he pulled over to ask if they needed help. They came up to him and were so grateful that he stopped. They told him they had run out of gas and asked if they could hop in with him and ride up to the next town. Ricky said, "Fine, climb on in." The 3 men got into his car and they took off. After that, Ricky has no memory of what happened. He believes one of them drugged him by putting something in his drink, which was sitting in the center console and was open, but he does not know for sure. Ricky remembers waking up and he was in a camp. He sat up, unrestrained, and looked out in front of him. The 3 guys who had gotten into the car with him were sitting on rocks looking at him, and one of them had a gun that he was aiming directly at Ricky. Ricky was just looking around, not really sure what was going on, when one of them got up, came over, and offered him water. Ricky took a sip of the water because he was extremely thirsty, and he believes the water was poisoned as well because shortly after taking a sip, he passed out again. When Ricky regained consciousness a second time, he could not move. It was completely dark, and he felt something tugging at his skin. As he lay there, he realized there was black plastic right over his face. He had been buried alive. He then realized there was a wild dingo standing on his chest that had tugged the plastic away from his face because the dog was trying to take a bite out of him. But the dog was actually the one that saved his life by creating an air pocket in the plastic. Ricky screamed at the dog, and the animal panicked, leaping out of the hole and running away. Ricky was able to work his fingers up to this hole, pull it all the way open, and push himself out of the plastic. He realized there was not much dirt or rocks placed over him. They probably thought he would just suffocate in the middle of the desert and no one would find him anyway. He stood up in his grave and looked around. There was no sign of the 3 men, and his car was gone. They had also taken all of his clothing, even his shoes. He had no food, no water, and he was in the middle of the desert with no roads, no people, and no buildings in sight. Confusion overtook Ricky because he just could not make sense of what had happened to him. Who were these 3 people? Why did they attack him? Did they just want to steal his car, and were they prepared to kill him just to take it? He sat down in the shade of a small bush and stayed there for several hours, thinking about what to do, but he was not one to let pessimism crowd his psyche. He decided that if he was going to survive, he needed to get up and get moving. After 10 days of just wandering through the desert and seeing absolutely nobody, he came across a fairly large water hole. He decided that he would have a better chance of surviving if he just waited there until someone came and rescued him, rather than keeping on walking through the desert where he was bound to eventually collapse and die. So, he made a makeshift shelter next to the waterhole and began to wait. After almost a week of being at this spot, Ricky had still not had a single thing to eat since his ordeal began. His stomach was in knots, he was in extreme pain, and he was starving. Just then, a lizard happened to run across the ground in front of him. Without even thinking, he reached out, grabbed it, and took a bite out of it. It was like a primal side of him was suddenly unleashed, and he had no issues eating anything that moved. For weeks, Ricky stayed at this spot, drinking from the water hole and eating lizards, frogs, leeches, snakes, grasshoppers, and caterpillars. Basically, anything that moved anywhere near his camp, he would chase it down and eat it. He actually developed an affinity for certain frogs over others, and he said that in terms of eating leeches, they were okay, but you needed to eat them really quickly, otherwise they would attach to the inside of your mouth. He also ate plants, though he had no idea what was harmful and what was safe. He just ate what tasted good and got lucky. But as much as Ricky was eating, it was not enough. He was slowly losing his battle with the desert, and he was starving to death. He believed he did not have enough time to just continue waiting at this particular spot, and that he needed to go out and find help. So, he left the waterhole and began stumbling through the desert all over again. But he was so weak that he only lasted for a couple of days before he found another waterhole. He stopped there and built yet another shelter, this time believing it would become his tomb. Over the next couple of days, wild dogs began coming to his camp and circling his shelter. It was like they knew he was about to die soon, or they at least knew he was weak enough that they could probably overpower him. At night, Ricky had to barricade the door of his shelter because the dogs would get aggressive, coming up to the door and trying to paw their way inside. On the 70th day of his ordeal, Ricky believed he was probably within a day or two of passing away, so he put a makeshift cross on the outside of his shelter. He believed this place would be his tomb, and he wanted someone to notice the cross, find his body, and let his family know what had happened to him. But on the 71st day, when Ricky happened to be standing outside of his shelter, two ranch hands who were way off the road in the outback happened to look in his direction, and they saw him. When they went over to him, they said he looked like a walking skeleton. Ricky practically collapsed as soon as he saw help had finally arrived. The ranch hands evacuated Ricky from the desert and brought him to a hospital where he weighed less than 100 pounds. At the beginning of his ordeal, he had weighed over 230 pounds. Despite filing a detailed report with the police about the three men who attacked him, they were never caught. Ricky checked himself out of the hospital after 6 days and made a full recovery. He ended up writing a book about his experience, and he now works construction in Dubai. Now, let us turn our attention to our final story, which takes us from the hot sands of Australia to the freezing vertical world of the Peruvian Andes. This is a place where the air is thin, the cold is bone-chilling, and a single misstep can send you falling thousands of feet to your death. By 1985, the remote and extremely dangerous west face of the Ciula Grande in the Peruvian Andes was still unclimbed. But in 1985, two very ambitious climbers, 25-year-old Joe Simpson and 21-year-old Simon Yates, decided they were going to be the first to conquer it. By all accounts, they seemed up for the job, having already conquered numerous difficult Scottish ice cliffs, as well as a number of large mountain faces in the Alps. So, in early June of that year, the pair flew to Peru and arrived at the base camp nearest to the Ciula Grande. It was still 5 miles away, so they could not actually see the face they were going to climb yet. On June 5th, when the weather was good enough, the pair left camp and worked their way around the huge lake and across the glacier to the base of this massive cliff. When they saw it for the first time, they could not believe how steep and dangerous it looked. But over the next 3 days, they managed to make it up this cliff despite a blizzard hitting them halfway through, and they reached the summit. To them, this was a crowning achievement. They had done it, and they had written their names in the history books. But in reality, the thing that people would remember them for was not for reaching the top of Ciula Grande, it was for what happened when they started going down. Because of how steep this mountain was, and because of the blizzard that was not going away, but was actually getting worse, the descent was going to be much more challenging than the ascent. Shortly after 10 o'clock on the morning of June 8th, Joe and Simon left the summit and began very carefully making their way down the mountain. At 11 o'clock, disaster struck. Joe lost his footing and fell to the bottom of an ice cliff, shattering his leg. Initially, they both assumed this was a death sentence for Joe. There was no way he could climb down the mountain, and certainly Simon could not carry him down. They were so high up, and it was so steep that it seemed impossible. But Simon wanted to at least try to save his friend. He climbed down to him, gave him some mild painkillers that he had, and then he attached his rope to Joe. Simon anchored himself in the snow and began lowering Joe down the mountain using all 300 feet of his rope. When he would stop, Joe would anchor himself in the snow with his ice picks, and then Simon would climb down to Joe and repeat the process over and over again, lowering him 300 feet at a time. This went on for hours and hours of back-breaking work for Simon. Joe, meanwhile, was in excruciating pain from his broken leg. To make matters worse, the storm had gotten so bad that the visibility between them was zero. As Simon was lowering Joe, he could not see what he was lowering Joe onto. But they had no other choice. That was the only way they could get him down. At 5 o'clock that night, Simon accidentally lowered Joe over a cliff. As soon as Joe was hanging off the edge, all of his weight was on the rope, and suddenly the rope was flying out of Simon's hands. Simon managed to stop him from careening over the edge, but now Simon was the only thing holding Joe from tumbling to his death, and Simon was being slowly dragged down the mountain. He could not anchor himself in, and they were in the middle of this inhospitable environment in the middle of the night. A storm was raging, it was freezing cold, and they could not communicate with each other. They could not hear each other or see each other. Simon was just hoping that Joe would be able to grab onto something and take his weight off the rope, otherwise this was going to end badly for both of them. But unfortunately, the cliff was at an angle, so Joe was dangling in midair and could not touch the wall. He had nothing to grab onto, and he was just dangling in the air. As Simon tried to move the rope to signal to Joe to take his weight off the rope, Joe was trying to climb up the rope, but his hands were starting to get frostbitten. He was weak, he was in pain, and he could not do anything about it. For the next 2.5 hours, Simon was desperately trying to regain an anchor in the snow, but every second that went by, he was getting pulled farther and farther down the mountain. He could not see how close he was to the edge, but he knew he was getting close. Finally, at 7:30 that night, with no other option, Simon pulled out a knife and cut the rope. As soon as the rope was cut, Simon fell backward. He was safe, and nothing was pulling him off the cliff any longer. But he knew he had just sent Joe to his death. Except Joe did not die. When that rope was cut, he fell 150 feet and smashed into the ground, but what he hit was a thin sheet of ice that broke from his weight, and he fell another 80 feet into a massive ice crevasse. Joe was knocked unconscious from the fall, but when he woke up, he was laying on his side. He opened his eyes, freezing, looked around, and could not believe he was alive. He did not know where he was, as it was totally dark. He turned on his headlamp and realized he had fallen into an ice crevasse. He looked down and saw he was on a little ledge that was overlooking a much deeper fall. The crevasse seemed to go on infinitely into a black chasm, and he realized that had he fallen even a foot to the side, that is where he would have gone. It was a miracle he was alive. But now he was trapped in the middle of an ice crevasse 80 feet down. He could not go down, and he could not go up. At the time, Joe did not know if Simon had fallen off the cliff with him or if he had cut the rope, but the rope was still attached to his waist and it fed up and out of the crevasse. He grabbed it and pulled on it until it all came tumbling back down, and he saw it was frayed. Sure enough, Simon had cut the rope. Even though Joe was not mad at Simon for the decision he made, because he understood it was the right one, Joe still became very emotional when he saw this. He felt so completely alone, and he was so sad. For a little while, he just kind of freaked out, screaming and crying, not knowing what he was going to do. After that, he sat down, knowing he was not getting out of there, and that he was going to die a slow, horrible, painful death. Joe remembers reaching up and turning off his headlamp, which retrospectively he thought was kind of goofy because he was about to die inside of this crevasse and he was saving batteries. But with the light off, he sat on the ledge and heard all the sounds coming from inside the crevasse. It was this awful, grinding, moaning sound. He said it was so terrifying sitting in the darkness listening to that sound that he reached up and turned his light back on just for comfort. Back up on the mountain, Simon was devastated. He felt like he had just killed his friend, and even though he understood why he did it, it did not change the fact that he felt incredibly guilty. That night, he did not even move from his position. He dug a little snow cave, laid down, and eventually fell asleep. The next morning when he got up, he began moving his way down the mountain. He finally rounded the area where Joe had been hanging off that cliff, and he got a chance to look down and see where Joe might have wound up. To his horror, he saw this massive opening to a crevasse that seemed almost bottomless, confirming that Joe had definitely died. Nonetheless, Simon went down to the edge of the crevasse and yelled for Joe, screaming for him to call out if he was still alive. But he never heard anything back, and with a heavy heart, Simon turned around and started heading back to base camp. A little while after Simon had left, Joe finally woke up. He had been asleep when Simon was yelling down for him. Joe wakes up, realizes this was not a bad dream, and starts yelling for Simon, but after a while he realized Simon was not coming back. Simon thought he was dead already. At this point, Joe decides he needs to try to climb out of the crevasse, even with a broken leg. He gets his ice picks and starts making his way up the ice wall, but he cannot put any weight on his broken leg, and he keeps falling down. He realized he could not climb this wall, probably not even with two good legs. So Joe had two choices. He could wait on the ledge and hope to be rescued, but by his calculations, it was highly unlikely anyone would come. Or he could go down deeper into the crevasse, having no idea where it goes, hoping that somewhere down in that black void, there was an opening that led back out to the outside of the mountain. He made his choice. He screwed an anchor into the ice, put his rope through it, tested it, and looked down into the void one last time. He knew that as soon as he stepped off this ledge, he could not come back up. This was a one-way trip, and if he made it to the bottom of his rope and did not find a ledge or a tunnel, he would fall to his death. On purpose, he did not put a knot at the end of his rope, figuring either he would find a way out or he would not, but at least it would be quick. Down he went, about 80 feet into this pitch-black crevasse. He got to a point where the walls came together, and he was able to squeeze through. Once he got through that point, it was like the center of an hourglass, where below it, the space opened up. As soon as he pushed through, he could actually see the ground. He saw flat ground, and there was light shining on it, which meant there was a hole leading out to the mountain. He went all the way down, touched the bottom, and disconnected from his rope. He climbed his way up an incline to where the sun was coming in, which was a hole leading right back out onto the mountain. He crawled out, tumbled onto the snow, and remembered just laying on the mountain looking at the sun and laughing. He could not believe it. But after the initial relief wore off, he realized he was not out of the woods yet. He still needed to climb down the rest of the mountain, and after that, he had to navigate 5 miles back to base camp. Over several delirious, painful, and miserable days, he managed to crawl all the way back to base camp. He got there right as Simon was packing up the tent and getting ready to leave. Simon could not believe he was looking at Joe alive. He just endlessly swore, unable to speak, feeling like he was looking at a ghost. But after that initial shock, Simon just gave Joe a massive hug, and they both cried and held each other. Joe underwent 6 surgical operations to repair the damage to his leg, and doctors told him he would never climb again, but after 2 years of intense rehabilitation, he was not only walking fine, but he was mountain climbing again. As for Simon, he managed to leave the mountain without serious physical injury, but he carried an enormous sense of guilt. Joe consistently states in every interview that Simon made the right decision, and that he is not at fault. Joe wrote a book about the experience called Touching the Void, which sold millions of copies worldwide and was adapted into a major motion picture. Today, they have drifted apart over the years, but they still consider each other friends. These 3 stories, though taking place in completely different corners of the world, all share a profound and deeply moving truth. They remind us that within every human being, there is a powerful primal drive to survive that can overcome the most impossible circumstances. When Tommy Ashcraft was lost at sea, when Ricky McGee was buried alive in the desert, and when Joe Simpson was trapped in the freezing depths of a crevasse, they all faced moments of absolute despair. They had every reason to give up, to let go, and to accept their fate. But they chose to fight. They chose to take one more step, to make one more calculation, to crawl one more mile. And in doing so, they proved that even in the darkest, most terrifying moments of our lives, the human spirit has the capacity to find a way back to the light. Their journeys leave us with a haunting and beautiful reminder of just how precious and how incredibly resilient human life truly is. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. This is a story about a brilliant young man who had millions of dollars in the bank, but was so completely consumed by a single terrifying thought that he ended up building a literal maze of death right beneath his own home. And because of his actions, a young 19-year-old man who trusted him with his life would find himself trapped in a pitch-black nightmare with absolutely no way out. To understand how this tragedy happened, we have to go back to the beginning of the story of Daniel Beckwith. Daniel was born in 1,991 inches, Bethesda, Maryland, which is a very quiet and wealthy suburb just outside of Washington, D.C. Daniel was the only child of 2 highly eccentric and incredibly intelligent parents named Linda and David. His father, David, had a doctoral degree and was a very accomplished opera singer who had actually performed at the White House. His mother, Linda, was a brilliant lawyer who had graduated from the prestigious Columbia Law School and had worked as a high-level government attorney. But Linda eventually decided that the legal profession was far too corrupt for her liking, so she gave it all up to become an opera singer just like her husband. When Daniel was just a toddler, his parents realized that he was not like other children. He taught himself how to read before he was even 3 years old. He had an incredibly high intellect, and his mother became fiercely protective of him. She decided that the public school system was simply not advanced enough to teach her brilliant son, so she chose to homeschool him. By the time Daniel was 5 years old, he was reading thick classic novels, and shortly after that, he figured out how to completely dismantle and reprogram his video game systems. But despite his massive intelligence, Daniel had a very lonely and isolated childhood. He was almost never allowed to go outside and play with the other children in the neighborhood. On the rare occasions that he was permitted to step outside, his parents would hover over him the entire time, watching his every move. And almost nobody from the neighborhood was ever allowed to come inside the Beckwith house. This was because Daniel's parents were severe hoarders. If you stepped through the front door of that house, you would immediately run into towering stacks of old papers, books, rotting cardboard boxes, and discarded food containers. Then, in the year 2000, when Daniel was 9 years old, his father was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease. This meant his mother had to take care of both her ailing husband and her young son, and under the immense stress, her eccentric behavior grew much worse. She became completely obsessed with protecting their property. If a neighbor walked even slightly too close to her lawn, Linda would run out of the front door and scream at them until they ran away. But despite how strange they were, anyone who knew the Beckwith family could tell that Linda and David absolutely adored their son. They just could not give him any personal space. One neighbor recalled seeing the family out trick-or-treating for Halloween, and even though Daniel was a teenager by then, all three of them were wearing matching giant hamster outfits. Daniel loved his parents, but as he grew older, he realized how smothering they really were. He wanted to connect with people his own age, so he turned to the internet. He found a community on an anonymous online forum called 4chan. On this forum, Daniel could pretend to be whoever he wanted. He created a tough guy persona, bragging to other users about how he had finished high school by age 15 and spent his free time building explosives in his backyard. But occasionally, Daniel would let his guard down and talk about a deep, paralyzing fear that occupied his thoughts at all times. This was his extreme fear of death. In 2010, it looked like Daniel's isolation might finally end. He enrolled at the University of Illinois to study computer science and electrical engineering. His parents dropped him off at the train station, and as the train pulled away, Daniel felt a massive wave of relief. He felt like he was finally free. But just a few months into his first semester, he received terrible news. His mother had been diagnosed with cancer. She had hidden her illness from everyone, including Daniel, and had refused to see a doctor. By the time Daniel rushed back home, she was in terrible shape, and she passed away just 2 weeks later. Only 3 people showed up to her funeral. Daniel stood there in mismatched clothes and pants that were far too short, looking completely dazed as he gave her eulogy, telling the small crowd that he felt totally lost. After he went back to college, his father's health began to decline rapidly, and Daniel had to place him into an assisted living facility. Living alone in his college apartment, Daniel was completely consumed by grief and a massive escalation of his fear of death. He had seen his mother die suddenly, and now he was watching his father slowly wither away. He went back onto the online forums and talked about taking a defensive position against his own mortality. To do this, Daniel researched the most common causes of death for young men his age. When he saw that car accidents were a leading cause, he went out and reinforced all the doors of his car with heavy Kevlar plates, and whenever he drove the car, he wore a thick, bulletproof Kevlar vest because he believed it would protect his internal organs from blunt force trauma in a crash. He also knew that cancer was a major killer, so he personally went to a doctor and demanded that every single mole on his body be surgically removed as a preventative measure. But the thing that Daniel feared most was not a car accident or a disease. He became absolutely convinced that a nuclear attack on the United States was imminent. He believed the only way to survive was to build a proper underground fallout shelter. Fortunately for him, his mother had left him a multi-million-dollar trust fund, so he had the money to do whatever he wanted. He put his college studies on hold, returned to his childhood home in Bethesda, went down into the basement, and began to dig a massive hole right in the center of the concrete floor. Over the next 2 years, Daniel split his time between his college classes and his secret project in Bethesda. He hired various contractors to come to his home and dig a massive, sprawling labyrinth of tunnels deep beneath his property. But in 2012, both his schoolwork and his tunnel digging came to a sudden halt because of his own bizarre behavior. Professors at his university began to report that someone was sneaking into their offices at night, hacking into their computers, and sending highly inappropriate and embarrassing emails to their entire contact lists of students and faculty. After sending the emails, the hacker would use superglue to seal the professor's office doors shut so they could not get inside the next morning. The university police department investigated the strange vandalism for months. Eventually, several students pointed them toward Daniel, noting that he was a genius-level hacker who had recently spoken at a major cybersecurity conference. A detective went to Daniel's apartment to talk to him, but Daniel did not answer the door. As the detective was standing in the hallway, he noticed a package sitting on the welcome mat. It was addressed to a person named S. Loomis Detwiler. The detective suspected this might be an alias for Daniel, so he went back to the station and ran the name through their databases. It turned out that this alias was connected to an online profile that had recently been bragging about breaking into university offices and hacking the professors. With this information, the police secured a search warrant for Daniel's apartment. When officers entered the apartment using a spare key, they were met with a scene of absolute chaos. The apartment was packed with towering piles of papers, books, computer wires, trash, and old food boxes. A dirty mattress with no sheets sat right in the middle of the room. On top of a mini fridge in the corner, detectives found Daniel's laptop. It was open and unlocked. The officers cloned his hard drive right then and there, and the digital evidence they recovered proved beyond a doubt that Daniel was indeed the hacker. Daniel was arrested and charged with multiple serious felonies, but right before his trial, his lawyers managed to secure a plea deal. Daniel immediately went onto the website Reddit and bragged to online users that he fully expected the state governor to step in and pardon him because he had donated a large sum of money to the governor's campaign, but that pardon never came. Fortunately for Daniel, the judge gave him a very light sentence. He was ordered to pay $23,000 in restitution to the university and was placed on 2 years of probation. But Daniel was expelled from the university, so he moved back into his childhood home in Bethesda to live alone. With no school to worry about, he poured all of his energy into building his underground bunker. He hired specialized contractors to expand the tunnels, digging deep into the earth and branching out in multiple directions, eventually crossing well past his own property lines. To fund his ongoing project, Daniel turned his attention to trading Bitcoin. Because of his mathematical brilliance, he became incredibly good at day trading cryptocurrency. Within a short period of time, he made millions of dollars. By 2015, his probation had ended and his massive underground bunker was mostly complete. He spent less time trading and more time sitting inside his bunker, live streaming on a popular website called Blab. During these live streams, Daniel talked at length about his investment strategies and how he had accumulated his fortune. But he was deeply paranoid about anyone discovering his real identity or his location. Whenever he went live, he wore a large, heavy fire protection hood that completely covered his head and face, and he used a voice changer to mask his voice. He went by the online username 3 Alarm Lamp Scooter. Among his small but very loyal group of followers was a 19-year-old young man named Askia Kafra. Askia lived in a pleasant, middle-class neighborhood only 15 minutes away from Daniel's house, but he had no idea they were neighbors. Daniel always claimed that he lived in a secret underground bunker somewhere deep in the state of Virginia. Askia completely idolized this mysterious online millionaire. Askia was the son of hardworking immigrants from Trinidad, and he desperately wanted to be successful and wealthy. When Askia turned 18, he had received a $100,000 financial settlement from a childhood lead poisoning lawsuit. For a brief moment, he got a taste of what it was like to be rich. But he was young and naive, and he quickly blew through all of the money on expensive dinners, designer clothes, and renting high-end sports cars like Mercedes and BMWs. Once the money was completely gone, Askia was determined to get it all back. He came up with a business plan to build a new smartphone app called Equity Shark. The app was designed to be a crowdfunding platform that would allow average people to invest small amounts of money into promising new startup companies. Askia was convinced that this app was going to make him a billionaire. But he had no money left to actually build the app. He and his business partner applied for a $100,000 grant for young entrepreneurs who had dropped out of college, which Askia had recently done. Askia was highly confident they would get the grant, but he still had many of the blind spots of a young man learning how to navigate the adult world. His biggest weakness was that he was incredibly trusting, and he was quick to believe anyone who seemed successful. It was during this time that Askia found Daniel's live streams on Blab. He was amazed by this wealthy figure who called himself 3-Alarm Lamp Scooter. When Daniel mentioned to his viewers that he was looking to make some new business investments, Askia saw his chance. He reached out to Daniel and asked if he and his partner could pitch their app, Equity Shark, to him. Daniel agreed. In June of 2016, Askia and his partner went to a local hookah bar to meet this mysterious investor. They had no idea what he actually looked like because he always wore the fire protection hood online. But as soon as Daniel walked through the door of the bar, they knew it was him. Daniel was wearing an incredibly bulky, oversized shirt, and it was obvious to everyone in the room that he was wearing a heavy bulletproof vest underneath it. Askia and his partner simply overlooked this strange behavior, assuming it was just another one of the eccentricities of a tech genius. They sat down and pitched Equity Shark to Daniel. They explained that their success rested on securing the $100,000 grant, which they were absolutely certain they would receive. Daniel was highly impressed by their pitch, and he agreed to invest $5,000 of his own money into their company. But he made them sign an agreement stating that they had to pay him back using the grant money, and if they did not get the grant, they would have to find another way to repay him. Askia was thrilled. He felt that getting the grant was a sure thing, so there was absolutely no risk in taking Daniel's money. Shortly after securing the $5,000, the program manager for the grant called Askia and told him that his company had made it to the second round. They needed to fly out to San Francisco to pitch their idea in person. Askia and his partner were incredibly excited. They immediately called Daniel to tell him the good news, and then they booked their flights. But in their excitement and lack of travel experience, they made a massive mistake. They booked their flights to Los Angeles International Airport instead of San Francisco, which put them 400 miles south of where they needed to be. When they landed in Los Angeles and realized what they had done, they panicked. They tried to rent a car to drive north, but because they were under 25, no rental car company would give them a vehicle. In desperation, they realized they were old enough to rent a U-Haul moving truck. They rented a massive U-Haul and began speeding up the California highway, trying to make it to San Francisco in time for their meeting. But they made another critical error. They entered the wrong address into their GPS, which sent them miles in the wrong direction. By the time they finally arrived at the meeting location in San Francisco, they were hours late. The grant manager was extremely upset and told them to just go back home and wait for a phone call. Back in Maryland, Askia was deeply embarrassed. He confessed to Daniel that they had completely ruined the trip and that they likely would not receive the grant. Askia asked Daniel if he would be willing to invest even more money to help them salvage the app, but Daniel was clearly losing interest in Equity Shark and was hesitant to put any more of his fortune into it. Hoping to stay in Daniel's good graces and prove his worth, Askia offered to do some physical labor for him. He had heard Daniel mention on his live streams that he was looking to expand some of the underground tunnels in his bunker, and Askia offered to do the digging. Daniel was eager to hire him, but he told Askia that because the bunker was a highly classified and secret location, there would be very strict security rules. Daniel explained that he could not allow anyone to know the address of his home because of the imminent threat of a nuclear strike. Askia agreed to all of the rules. On the 28th of January 2017, just after 2 o'clock in the morning, Askia stood outside his house waiting to be picked up. Daniel arrived in a minivan, got out, and handed Askia a pair of heavily modified safety goggles that had been painted completely black so that Askia could not see anything. Daniel then put the goggles on Askia's head, guided him into the passenger seat, and began to drive. Daniel drove in continuous looping circles on the highway and back and forth through various neighborhoods. He wanted to make Askia believe they were traveling to a remote location far away in Virginia, when in reality, they were just driving in circles before heading back to Daniel's house only 15 minutes away. When they pulled into the driveway, Daniel kept the blackout goggles on Askia's face. He tied a string to Askia's wrist and led him like a blind dog out of the van and toward the house. Inside, Daniel carefully guided him through the narrow, cluttered pathways between the massive piles of hoarded trash and papers. They walked all the way to the back of the house, went down the stairs, and entered the basement. In the basement, Daniel had constructed a highly complex maze using chicken wire, stacks of old bicycles, books, and heaps of junk. This maze was specifically designed so that even if a worker came up out of the tunnels, they would be completely disoriented and would not be able to find their way out of the basement without help. Daniel led Askia through this bizarre, dark maze until they reached a gaping hole in the concrete floor. This was the entrance to the underground tunnel system. Only then did Daniel allow Askia to remove his blackout goggles. When Askia looked down into the hole, he was absolutely stunned. He saw a massive, clean, and well-lit network of tunnels stretching out in multiple directions beneath the house. He looked at Daniel in disbelief, asking how far the tunnels actually went, and Daniel proudly told him that the system was enormous. Daniel handed Askia a heavy pickaxe, a shovel, and a hard hat. Then he explained the working conditions. He told Askia that whenever he was down in the tunnels, Daniel would have to place a heavy cover over the entrance hole for security reasons. He also told Askia that because the transport process with the blindfold was so difficult, it would be much easier if Askia simply lived down in the tunnels for several days at a time. Daniel assured him that he would be perfectly comfortable. There was a mattress to sleep on, a strong Wi-Fi connection, plenty of lighting, and a 5-gallon plastic bucket to use as a toilet. Askia was uncomfortable with the idea of living in a hole in the dirt, but he trusted Daniel completely, and he was excited to be working for a millionaire whom he respected so much. So, he agreed. Over the next few months, Askia made the bizarre, blindfolded journey to Daniel's house on a regular basis. He spent days at a time underground, breathing in heavy dirt and dust as he used a pickaxe to carve new paths through the earth. But toward the end of the spring, Askia received the devastating news he had been dreading. Equity Shark had been officially rejected for the $100,000 grant. Askia was completely crushed. He also knew that he now had no way to pay back the $5,000 he owed to Daniel. He asked Daniel if he could increase his hours digging in the tunnels to slowly work off his debt. Daniel agreed. On the 10th of September 2017, Askia was back down in the tunnels. He was working in one of the deepest and lowest sections of the bunker. To reach this area, he had to squeeze his body through a very narrow and tight space. Askia had actually sent a text message to his friends earlier that day, telling them that the tunnel was making him feel incredibly claustrophobic, but he knew he had to keep going to pay off his debt. At around 4 o'clock that afternoon, while Askia was deep in the narrow tunnel, the power suddenly went completely out. Everything fell into a pitch-black silence. Upstairs in the main house, Daniel noticed the power outage. He walked down the stairs into the basement, navigated through his chicken wire maze, and located the main electrical circuit breaker. He flipped the heavy switch, and the power instantly surged back on. But as the power returned, Daniel heard a loud, high-pitched buzzing sound coming from upstairs in the kitchen. He became extremely worried that the sound was being caused by an electrical short circuit that could spark a fire. Instead of checking on Askia first, Daniel immediately reached out and flipped the main circuit breaker back off, plunging Askia back into absolute pitch-black darkness deep underground. Daniel then made his way back through the basement maze, walked up the stairs, and entered the kitchen to find the source of the buzzing sound. But as soon as he stepped into the hallway, he smelled a strong scent of smoke. He turned around and looked back down the basement stairs, and he saw thick, black smoke rapidly billowing up from the basement. Daniel ran back down the stairs and screamed out for Askia. From somewhere deep inside the pitch-black tunnels, he heard Askia's muffled voice yell back, asking what was going on. Daniel screamed for him to get out of there immediately, but the heat and the thick smoke were quickly becoming unbearable. Daniel was forced to run back up the stairs and exit the house to catch his breath in the fresh air. A few moments later, Daniel tried to go back inside. He ran down to the basement stairs, but when he reached the bottom, he did not see Askia. Instead, he saw giant orange flames leaping out of the tunnel entrance. He screamed Askia's name over and over, but there was no response. The heat was too intense, and Daniel had to flee the house. A neighbor saw Daniel standing outside in his yard, screaming hysterically as thick black smoke poured out of the windows of the home. The neighbor immediately called 911. While Daniel was pacing outside, Askia was trapped in a living nightmare. He was deep underground in total darkness. The tunnels were rapidly filling with thick, toxic smoke from the electrical fire. Askia began to crawl desperately through the narrow dirt tunnel, trying to find his way back to the main entrance. Because it was completely dark and his eyes were burning from the smoke, he kept hitting dead ends. But through sheer survival instinct, Askia miraculously managed to find his way back to the main entrance hole. He scrambled out of the hole, gasping for air, only to find himself in a basement that was completely engulfed in flames and thick smoke. This was the moment where Daniel's paranoid security measures became a death sentence. Every single time Askia had been in this basement, he had been wearing blackout goggles. He had absolutely no idea what the layout of the basement looked like. He did not know where the stairs were, and he could not see anything through the dense smoke. He was trapped inside a maze of chicken wire, towering piles of junk, and old bicycles. Desperate to escape the heat, Askia began to scramble over the chicken wire and push past the burning piles of trash. He managed to squeeze past a burning furnace, searching for any sign of an exit. In the distance, through the smoke, he saw a faint glimmer of light. It was a small basement window. Askia rushed toward the window, but as he got closer, his heart sank. Daniel had installed heavy metal security bars over the outside of the window. There was no way to squeeze through them. But Askia refused to give up. In his desperation, he grabbed an old rolling office chair from the clutter, pushed it in front of the window, and climbed on top of it. He used his bare hands to smash the glass pane, hoping he could somehow bypass the bars or scream for help. But the metal bars were set deep into the concrete foundation. They would not budge. After several agonizing minutes of fighting for his life, the toxic smoke overcame him. Askia lost consciousness, fell backward off the chair, and was consumed by the fire. When the fire department finally managed to extinguish the massive blaze, they searched the charred ruins of the basement. They found Askia's body lying directly beneath the small broken window. When investigators first questioned Daniel about why a 19-year-old boy was working in his basement, Daniel tried to downplay the situation. He lied and told the police that the basement was just a cool bachelor pad and that Askia must have simply been asleep down there when the fire started. But as fire investigators began to clear away the debris to find the cause of the fire, they discovered the entrance to the massive underground tunnel system. They were absolutely stunned by the scale of the excavation. As they mapped out the tunnels and examined the basement, they realized the horrific truth of what had happened to Askia. They realized that Daniel had essentially placed Askia into a physical death trap. When the power went out, Askia was trapped deep underground with no light and no way to know that a fire had started. By the time he managed to crawl out of the hole, the basement was already a burning inferno, and because of the chicken wire maze and the piles of hoarded junk, Askia was completely disoriented. The most tragic detail of the investigation was that when Askia was standing on that chair trying to break through the barred window, he was only 2 steps away from a door that led directly to safety. If he had only known which way to turn, he would have lived. But because he had always been blindfolded, he had no idea the door was there. The investigation also revealed that the entire house was a massive fire hazard. Daniel had run dozens of cheap extension cords and heavy-duty power strips from the main house down into the tunnels to power the lights and the Wi-Fi. The electrical system of the old house was simply not built to handle that kind of power load, which is what ultimately triggered the catastrophic electrical fire. Following an intense 8-month investigation, the state prosecutors decided to take action. They charged Daniel Beckwith with involuntary manslaughter, but they also charged him with a much more serious and rare charge in the American legal system. He was charged with second-degree depraved heart murder. This specific charge is used when a person's actions show an utter and complete disregard for the value of human life, to the point where their negligence is so extreme that it is legally treated as an intentional killing. The prosecution argued that by blindfolding Askia, forcing him to work in a dark hole with a blocked exit, and creating a physical maze in a hoarded house, Daniel had created a situation where death was almost inevitable if anything went wrong. They also pointed out that when the power went out, Daniel chose to protect his house from a potential fire by shutting off the breaker, knowingly leaving Askia trapped in the dark while the house burned. During the emotional trial, Askia's parents sat in the courtroom, weeping as they listened to the details of their son's final moments. They described Askia as a loving, ambitious boy who had his whole life ahead of him, but whose trusting nature had been exploited by a paranoid and wealthy man who cared more about his secret bunker than the safety of his workers. Daniel's defense team argued that the fire was a tragic accident and that Daniel had tried to save Askia by running back into the house. But the jury did not agree. They found Daniel guilty of both involuntary manslaughter and second-degree depraved heart murder. He was sentenced to 9 years in state prison. This case left a lasting impact on the quiet community of Bethesda. The massive tunnel system that Daniel spent years and hundreds of thousands of dollars to dig was eventually filled in with concrete by the city to prevent the surrounding homes from collapsing. Today, the property stands empty, a quiet and eerie reminder of a young man's brilliant mind that was completely destroyed by paranoia, and a tragic young victim who simply wanted to build a better life for himself, but ended up trapped in a nightmare. A young man trusted the wrong person, walked into a hidden underground world, and never made it back out. It's one of the strangest and most tragic cases in recent memory. If you want another true story that's just as unbelievable, click the next video on your screen right now. If you Google the most incredible story of all time, this story pops up all over the internet. When you read through it, you will completely understand why. Let us go straight to Muskegon, Michigan in the early 1940s. A young man named Joseph Byerly was living a normal, ordinary life. He was a great athlete and a senior at his high school. He was so talented that he actually earned a full scholarship to attend Notre Dame University. He had a bright future, and his parents were very proud. But then, in December of 1941, everything changed. The Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, and the United States entered World War II. When Joseph graduated in 1942, he had a massive decision to make. He had this amazing college opportunity, but he just could not bring himself to go. He saw all the other young men his age going off to fight, and he realized he could not sit in a safe classroom while others were risking their lives. So, he turned down his scholarship and enlisted in the Army. He immediately volunteered for one of the most dangerous units in the entire Army, the parachute infantry. To become a paratrooper, Joseph had to survive a training regimen that was absolute hell. The instructors pushed these young men to their absolute physical limits every single day. Joseph spent hours doing physical training in blistering, humid heat that made it hard to breathe. They went on exhausting forced marches that lasted for miles and miles, carrying heavy backpacks. They had to run up steep mountains carrying their full combat gear, with their heavy boots pounding against the dirt until their lungs burned and their legs felt like lead. By 1943, Joseph was fully trained and stationed in England, desperate to put his training to the test. But the massive Allied invasion of occupied France was still several months away. Joseph did not want to wait around in a barracks doing nothing. So, when the military started looking for volunteers for an incredibly dangerous and highly classified mission, he stepped forward immediately. This mission was run by the OSS, which was the predecessor to the modern CIA. The OSS officers sat the volunteers down and explained that they would be parachuting in the middle of the night, completely alone, into Nazi-occupied France. Each volunteer would carry a heavy backpack loaded with solid gold bars. Once they hit the ground, they had to find the French resistance and hand the gold over so they could fund their operations. The resistance would try their best to protect them and smuggle them back to England, but there were absolutely no guarantees. The OSS officers made it very clear that if they were caught, they would be brutally tortured and executed as spies. But Joseph did not hesitate. He boarded the plane in the dark, jumped out into the night, and successfully completed the mission. He managed to deliver the gold and get back to England safely. He liked the rush of the mission so much that when they asked for volunteers again shortly after, he signed up and completed a second successful jump. Shortly after his second mission, word came down that the D-Day invasion was set to take place on June 6th. Joseph's unit was told they would be parachuting into France the night before to destroy bridges, cut power supply lines, and soften up the defenses before the main invasion force hit Utah Beach just a couple of hours later. So, in the dead of night on June 5th, Joseph and his unit were flying over France when their transport plane was suddenly struck by heavy enemy fire. As their plane was literally falling to the ground in flames, Joseph leaped out of the door into the dark sky. But the problem was, he was only 400 feet off the ground, which is extremely low for a jump. His parachute inflated just in time, and he managed to survive the fall, but he landed right on top of a stone church where a German sniper was positioned in the steeple. The sniper spotted him on the roof and began taking shots, forcing Joseph to dodge the bullets before slipping off the roof and running out of sight. Once on the ground, Joseph was completely alone with no idea where the rest of his unit was. He loaded his M1 carbine and began an incredible one-man mission. He ran from the church under sniper fire and eventually made it to the town's power substation, which he blew up with thermite to cut the power to the entire town. From there, he went building to building, fighting every German soldier he came across, including an entire squad of German infantry that he ambushed with hand grenades. At some point, Joseph made his way over to one of the bridges leading into this town that, if he blew up, would prevent the Germans from sending reinforcements to Utah Beach. But as he crawled through one of the thick hedgerows near the bridge, he fell headfirst into a German machine gun nest. When he turned around, there were multiple machine guns pointed right at his face. He had no choice but to raise his hands and surrender. The Germans marched Joseph to a POW holding area, but as soon as he got there, massive explosions ripped through the camp. It was not clear if it was German artillery or American aircraft, but shells were killing both guards and prisoners. A piece of shrapnel tore into Joseph's leg, blowing him into a ditch. Despite being in agonizing pain, he took this as an opportunity to escape. He got up and ran as best as he could, remaining uncaught for 12 hours before he was caught again. This time, they locked him in the back of a covered truck to send him to St. Lo. But on the way, an Allied aircraft strafed the vehicle. Joseph survived the attack and was able to leap out of a hole in the side of the truck. He attempted to escape, but was caught again. The Germans got him to St. Lo, and that night, the Americans launched an all-night bombing campaign. Joseph narrowly survived, which is a recurring theme in his story because he was repeatedly almost killed by his own teammate. For the next few days, German officers interrogated Joseph 20 to 24 hours a day. He did not give them any information, repeatedly calling them names until they got so fed up they just beat him unconscious. He was kept in a hospital for several days to recover. For the next 3 months, Joseph was starved, beaten, and moved to multiple camps, forced to do back-breaking labor all day while weathering hunger, disease, and exhaustion. At one point, he was locked inside a crowded boxcar with 50 other men. The train was strafed by Allied planes, and Joseph was one of the very few people to survive. In September of 1944, Joseph was moved to a prison camp in Poland that held 12,000 Russian prisoners. As soon as he got there, he immediately began planning his next escape. 2 months later, on a freezing night in November, Joseph, along with 3 other American prisoners, managed to cut the barbed wire, snuck out of the camp, and began making their escape south. They snuck into a nearby railway station and hopped on a train car they believed was headed deeper into Poland. Their plan was to meet up with the Soviet Red Army as it pushed through the region. But unfortunately, they got on the wrong train and they wound up in Berlin, the capital of Nazi Germany. Now, one thing you do not hear much about when it comes to World War II is there was actually a large number of Germans who hated Hitler and totally disagreed with the Nazis. They had organized a secret German underground resistance designed to help the Allies during the war. So, when Joseph and the other 3 American prisoners arrived in Berlin, still wearing their prisoner uniforms, a member of the German resistance saw them and immediately grabbed them, bringing them into hiding. But after only a week, the infamous Nazi secret police, also known as the Gestapo, discovered them and arrested them. Over the next few days, Joseph and the other American prisoners got to see firsthand just how awful the Gestapo really were. They were constantly interrogated while being beaten, kicked, walked on, and strung up by their arms backwards. They were hit with whips, clubs, and rifle butts until they drifted into unconsciousness. As soon as they started to come to, the torture would start all over again. After those 10 days, the Gestapo finally turned Joseph and the other 3 American prisoners over to the German army, who put them in the brutal prison camp called Stalag Luft III. Upon arrival, Joseph was immediately sentenced to 30 days inside a 4x5-foot pine box that was too small to stand up or lay down in. Fortunately for him, he only had to endure 7 days because a Red Cross operative from Geneva intervened on his behalf. It would take months for Joseph to get his strength back after being inside of this box, but as soon as he did, he began plotting his next escape. One night, Joseph, along with his 3 American prisoner buddies, managed to break through a prison wall and made a mad dash for freedom. But the Nazi prison guards saw them and opened fire on them. All 3 of Joseph's friends were shot and killed as they ran. Joseph got away, only to hear the faint barking of the German shepherds the Nazis had sent to hunt him down. So, in the freezing cold of Poland in January, Joseph leaped headfirst into a partially frozen river and swam over 2 miles down it before getting out and running blindly into the woods. Somehow, miraculously, he managed to reach Soviet lines before he froze to death. There, he spoke with the battalion commander, Alexandra Samasenko, an incredibly brave woman who holds the distinction of being the only female tank commander in all of World War II. Even though Joseph spoke very little Russian, he convinced her to let him join her unit, and so she gave him a gun and some ammunition, and she told him what their next objective was. It turns out they were going to liberate the same prison camp he had just escaped from. And so Joseph, alongside the Soviet Red Army that he now fought for, turned around and went to smash this prison camp. After the dust had settled, Joseph raided the main camp office and stole his defiant official prisoner of war photo that the Germans had taken of him on the first day he got captured. Joseph continued to fight alongside the Soviets across the Eastern Front for a couple of months. But when a German dive bomber blew up the tank that Joseph was riding on, he was badly wounded and evacuated to a Russian field hospital. There, he received a visit from Marshal Georgy Zhukov, the most important Soviet military commander in World War II, who was intrigued by the only non-Soviet in the hospital. He sat with Joseph and learned his story through an interpreter. Afterwards, he provided Joseph with official paperwork that would allow him to safely rejoin American forces. And so, in February of 1945, Joseph was sent to the United States Embassy in Moscow. But unfortunately, when he finally met a friendly American face after nearly a year of fighting behind enemy lines, they did not believe his story. They told him that Joseph R. Byerly had been killed in action on the 10th of June, 1944, and that they had already held a funeral mass in his honor in Muskegon, and that his obituary had already been printed in the local newspaper. But despite Joseph painstakingly going through his story over and over again, the ambassador just could not believe what he was hearing. Worried that Joseph might actually be a well-trained German spy, the ambassador sent him to Odessa to have his credentials verified. But Odessa had the same problem and could not verify him, so they sent him to Egypt. Egypt had the same problem, and they too could not verify his credentials, so they sent him to Italy, where they finally used his official fingerprints and confirmed that yes, this man is in fact the real Joseph R. Byerly. And so, on the 11th of April 1945, Joseph returned home to Muskegon, Michigan, and needless to say, his parents were very surprised to see him because they were completely convinced he had died 10 months earlier. Exactly 1 year later, Joseph would actually get married to his sweetheart in the exact same church that had held his funeral mass when everyone believed he was dead. Joseph was given the Purple Heart, and then in the 1990s, he was given additional presidential awards from United States President Bill Clinton, as well as the Russian President Boris Yeltsin. Joseph was also given a custom-made AK-47 from the guy who actually invented the AK-47, Mikhail Kalashnikov. Joseph died in 2004 at the age of 81, and his son would go on to become the United States ambassador to Russia under both President George W. Bush and President Barack Obama, completing an incredibly historic family legacy. Joseph died in 2004 at the age of 81, leaving behind one of the most extraordinary stories of World War II. But, believe it or not, there are even more unbelievable true stories just like this one. Click the next video on your screen, and I'll see you there. In 1989, a 22-year-old named Eloise Lindsay set out on a solo hiking trip through the Appalachian wilderness, hoping it would help her figure out what she wanted to do with her life. Instead, the trip would end with Eloise lost in the woods for nearly 3 weeks, convinced that something was following her through the trees. She had just graduated from college, a milestone that for many signals the start of a clear career path. But for Eloise, holding her degree felt less like a map and more like a blank page. She genuinely didn't know what she wanted to do next with her life. Being an experienced backpacker, she felt the call of the wilderness. She believed that a long, solitary journey through nature would give her the time and space she needed to think, to reflect, and to hopefully find some clarity. So she came up with a plan. When Eloise laid out this detailed plan for her parents, they weren't particularly concerned for her safety. They knew their daughter. They knew she was a capable and seasoned backpacker who had successfully completed similar trips before. They trusted her skills and her judgment. So, with their blessing, they wished her well and told her they'd see her when she got back. On November 4th, Eloise shouldered her pack and set out to begin her journey. The first couple of days were exactly what she had hoped for. The weather was beautiful, the autumn scenery along the trail was breathtaking, and the solitude was perfect. She had all the time in the world to be by herself, to look inward, and to think deeply about what her future might hold. But on the morning of the third day, everything changed. She woke up inside her tent, which she had pitched just off the trail the night before, and was immediately hit with an intense, overwhelming sense of dread. It was a heavy, suffocating feeling that she couldn't place. There was no obvious reason for it. She did a mental inventory, trying to figure out what was wrong. Had she forgotten a crucial piece of gear? Was there something about her route she was misremembering? But nothing came to mind. She tried to push the feeling aside, telling herself it was just a strange mood. She decided the best thing to do was to get moving, to pack up her camp and start hiking. She figured the physical activity and the change of scenery would help clear her head. So she unzipped her tent and stepped out into the cool morning air. As she began breaking down her campsite, she casually scanned the tree line. She wasn't looking for anything in particular, it was just a natural habit for a hiker, and that's when she saw it. She could have sworn she saw the figure of a man standing maybe 30 or 40 feet away, partially hidden behind a tree. She blinked, doing a double take, and stared at the spot. It was broad daylight, and she was near a popular trail. The idea of seeing another person wasn't unbelievable in itself. But the way he was standing there, just watching, felt odd. When she looked again, the person was gone. She stood frozen for a minute, her eyes locked on the spot where she'd seen him. Was her mind playing tricks on her? Did she really see someone? If there was another hiker there, why were they hiding? Why wouldn't they just say hello? Out here in the relative wilderness, hikers usually acknowledged each other. But this person never showed themselves again. As she stood there trying to decide what to do, she felt a powerful, prickling sensation on the back of her neck. It was the distinct feeling of being watched. And it felt exactly like the sense of dread she had woken up with inside her tent. A chilling thought entered her mind. Was her intuition, her sixth sense, trying to warn her that she was being observed by a predator? She had no proof, no concrete evidence, but the feeling was undeniable. Alone in the middle of the woods, even an experienced hiker like Eloise couldn't help but feel incredibly vulnerable. The fact that this man, if he was real, wouldn't show himself again made her feel threatened. The feeling quickly escalated into panic. She abandoned any attempt at being neat and orderly and started stuffing her gear into her pack as fast as she could. Her hands were shaking. As soon as her pack was on her back, she took off down the trail, walking quickly away from the campsite and the man she saw in the woods. As she hurried along the path, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was right behind her. She kept whipping her head around, her heart pounding, expecting to see someone there. But the trail behind her was always empty. Yet, that visceral feeling of being watched, that deep sense of dread, it just wouldn't go away. Her fast walk turned into a jog, and her jog turned into an all-out run. She realized she was in a very remote section of the trail, miles from any town or road. She was nowhere near her next planned stop. A new thought took hold of her. She had to get off this trail. She had to get to a road, to civilization, to safety, as quickly as humanly possible. She weighed her options. She could stay on the trail, but it would be many more miles and likely take her well into the night before she reached any kind of town. Or she could take a shortcut. She had a map, and she believed there was a road that ran parallel to the trail, but it was far down the mountain. Getting to it would mean leaving the marked path and bushwhacking through dense, unfamiliar wilderness. But the threat of the person or thing she felt was following her was so intense, so real to her, that she couldn't stand the idea of spending another night out in the woods being stalked. So she made a fateful decision. She stepped off the trail and started running straight down the steep, wooded mountainside. It wasn't long before she started to hear actual sounds coming from behind her. She was certain it was the person who was following her. She'd spin around, but there was never anyone there. She'd slow down, trying to listen as she walked, and she'd hear the distinct sound of footsteps in the leaves far behind her. Again, she'd turn and see nothing. but she was absolutely certain someone was back there stalking her. And then came a new sound. It was a low, guttural noise like a deep male voice, but it wasn't a language she could recognize. It was more like a grunt or a yell. Her heart rate soared. She was in full-blown panic now, crashing through the wilderness as fast as she could, praying she was headed towards the road. But after running for miles deep into the middle of nowhere, she hadn't found a road. The sun had set, and it was now completely dark. She knew she was hopelessly lost. She had no choice but to make camp. She knew that somewhere out there in the blackness of the woods was the person or thing that was hunting her. She was all alone, with no way to call for help. This was 1989, long before everyone carried a cell phone. With trembling hands, she set up her tent, crawled inside, zipped it up, and lay there, listening, hoping for silence. But sure enough, within minutes, she started to hear those sounds again. The low, audible grunts from somewhere in the forest. And then, the sound of heavy footsteps, walking in a wide circle around the perimeter of her campsite. All night long, she heard it. The footsteps never came right up to her tent. There was always some distance, but they were always there. Finally, the sun came up. The moment there was enough light to see, she scrambled out of her tent, packed it up in a frenzy, and started running again, desperately hoping she was moving in the direction of civilization. And all through that day, the terrifying cycle repeated. She had the constant sense that someone was watching her. She heard footsteps behind her, but saw nothing when she turned. She heard that low grunting voice from somewhere in the trees, but could never see who or what was making the sound. As the sun began to set again, she still hadn't found the road. She hadn't found a trail. She knew she couldn't even try to backtrack. If she turned around, she was bound to run straight into the very thing she was trying to escape. So once again, she found a spot to set up her campsite in the middle of nowhere. She got inside her tent, and just like the night before, as soon as she was lying down, she heard the heavy footsteps circling in the woods and the low, audible sound that she couldn't place. A couple of days later, the day Eloise was supposed to meet her friend at the 7-day mark, she never showed up. Her friend waited at the rendezvous point for several hours, growing more and more concerned. Finally, when it was clear Eloise wasn't coming, her friend left the trail, found a phone, and contacted the authorities to file a missing person report. The police immediately launched a massive search for Eloise along the stretch of the Appalachian Trail where she was supposed to be. For the next 14 days, hundreds of police officers, search and rescue volunteers, and helicopters scoured the area. But they found no sign of Eloise at all. After 2 full weeks of searching, the police had to make the difficult decision to call off the official search. 2 days after the search was terminated, which was now 23 days after Eloise had first set off on her hike, a hunter was out in a remote area near the trail. He stumbled upon Eloise propped up against a tree. She was totally emaciated, severely dehydrated, and delirious, but she was alive. At first, she was terrified of the hunter. In her confused state, she thought he was the person who had been following her. But when she finally realized he was there to help, she went with him. She was taken to a hospital, and aside from her severe dehydration and malnourishment, she was physically okay. In multiple interviews and in her official police statement, she detailed her terrifying ordeal. She insisted that she had been chased for nearly 3 weeks through the woods and that she had no idea who it was or why they were chasing her. Then she added another bizarre detail. She said that right before she was found, this person or thing that was following her got so close to her on a couple of occasions that she became absolutely terrified. She was so scared that she made a desperate choice. She ditched her backpack. Her backpack contained all of her life-saving equipment, her tent, her sleeping bag, her food and water. She threw it all away so she could be lighter, so she could run faster. tapas. You have to imagine the level of fear a person would have to be in to willingly abandon the one thing they need to survive in the wilderness. After ditching her pack with no supplies, no food, and no water, she stumbled across a tree in the middle of nowhere. And wedged inside a hollow in the trunk was a stash of donuts and pound cake. She took the food, and between that and water from a stream she found, that's what kept her alive for the last few days before the hunter found her. Eloise says she has no idea what to make of her experience, and law enforcement was just as baffled. Some believe she may have had a mental break, that she got lost, and her paranoia created an imaginary pursuer. Others, including some park rangers familiar with that part of the trail, believe it's possible she was stalked by so-called wild men, feral people who are said to live deep in the mountains, according to local legend. But as of today, there is no official explanation for what happened to Eloise Lindsay. On the 7th of June, 1951, two families from Santa Fe, New Mexico, the McGees and the Crosses, decided to spend a beautiful day together. They met up at the Santa Fe ski basin for a picnic to enjoy the fresh mountain air. During the summer months, when there's no snow on the ground, the ski basin is a very popular spot for hikers. The terrain is rugged, and the views from the top are absolutely incredible. But on this particular day, the two families just wanted to have a relaxing picnic at the base of the mountain, looking up at the slopes. As the parents began unpacking the car and setting up the picnic site, the kids started playing together. There was Larry and Janet McGee, a brother and sister who were 7 and 5 years old, and their friend, 3-year-old Stephen Cross. After they had finished laying out the blanket and the food, the parents looked around and realized the kids were gone. They had just seen them playing nearby only a minute or two before, so they figured they couldn't have gone very far. They started looking around, calling out their names, but there was no answer. Their calls became a little more urgent as they began to worry. They expanded their search, looking farther and farther from the picnic spot. They realized the only place the children could have gone was up into the dense woods that bordered the area. But the terrain there was very steep and very rugged. It seemed impossible that 3 young children, one of them a toddler, could have gotten very far up the mountain. And they weren't responding to their parents' calls. A terrible thought began to creep in. Maybe they had been abducted. One of the parents ran to the main building of the ski resort where a staff member was on duty and used the phone to call the authorities. When the police arrived, they immediately set up huge, powerful spotlights and aimed them up at the mountain. The idea was that if the kids had somehow wandered up into the woods and gotten lost, they would see the bright lights and hopefully walk down towards them. After setting up the lights, the police began a thorough search of the mountainside, hoping that the children were simply lost and not the victims of a kidnapping. But despite the spotlights and hundreds of searchers yelling out the children's names, they heard nothing back. They found no sign of the kids. They searched all through the night, and as the hours passed, the grim possibility of an abduction seemed more and more likely. By the following afternoon, things were really starting to look bleak. There was still no sign of the kids anywhere. That's when a searcher, who was way outside of the primary search area, made a startling discovery. He was about 3.5 miles away from the picnic site and thousands of feet up in elevation. He was getting ready to leave his assigned section when he saw something out of the corner of his eye that looked like a person. He turned and saw one of the children poking their head up from behind a large, downed log. The searcher ran over, and sure enough, all 3 kids were huddled together inside the hollow log. They were dirty and scared, but they were all okay. As the searcher was picking them up and radioing in the incredible news, he couldn't help but wonder how in the world these 3 little kids had managed to get so far away and so high up the mountain. Once the children were brought back down to the search headquarters, reunited with their tearful parents, and checked over by a doctor who confirmed they were okay, the police asked them the question on everyone's mind, how did you get all the way up there? Larry, the oldest of the group at 7 years old, was the one who answered. It took him a minute, but eventually he said that they had been playing near the picnic area and had wandered just a little way into the tree line. All of a sudden, he said, a bear came out from behind a tree and started chasing them. According to Larry, the three of them ran for their lives 3.5 miles up a steep mountain until they found the log, which they jumped inside of to hide. He claimed the bear was patrolling the area looking for them. But then Larry added another detail. He said that in addition to the bear, they were especially scared of the gorilla that was also walking around the area looking for them too. Now, it's easy to dismiss a child's story. You could say the gorilla they saw was just one of the searchers. But there were no searchers in that specific remote area near the log until the exact moment they were found. It was a last-ditch effort to expand the search, and it was a miracle they were located at all. Larry insisted that he and the other kids saw the gorilla and the bear on the first day and during the first night, long before any search teams were that far up the mountain. As for the bear, sightings in the Santa Fe ski basin are rare, but not unheard of. However, if a real bear had been chasing 3 small children, it would have caught them. There's no way 3 kids, especially a 3-year-old, could outrun a bear going uphill. So either there wasn't a bear or it was some other animal that just looked like a bear to them. But even if you discount the animals entirely and say the kids just got lost, there's still the problem of the distance. To cover 3.5 miles uphill through extremely rugged mountain terrain is an incredible feat for a 7-year-old and a 5-year-old. For a 3-year-old, it's practically impossible to do in a 2-4-hour period without help. The only way it might be possible is if the children were in absolute fear for their lives. The adrenaline rush from that kind of terror could potentially give them the strength and endurance to cover that distance. This lends a strange credibility to their story that they were, in fact, running for their lives. But what were they running from? A bear? A gorilla? We'll likely never know. Because the children were found alive and safe, the case was closed and everyone moved on. From 2002 to 2006, Cullen Finnerty was a force to be reckoned with in college football. He was arguably one of the most successful college quarterbacks in history, leading his team to 3 national championships and being named the Division II Player of the Decade. He was also known for being one of the toughest players on the field. Most quarterbacks are trained to avoid big hits, to slide or run out of bounds. Not Cullen. He stood 6'2", weighed 240 pounds, and he would tell his teammates that he actually wanted to get hit and that he would hit back. His coaches hated it, but his teammates loved his fearless, aggressive style. Cullen was also famous for playing through injuries. During his junior year in college, he broke his collarbone but didn't tell anyone. He played through an entire playoff series with the injury and still led his team to victory. After college, however, Cullen's professional football career didn't reach the same heights. He had brief stints with 2 NFL teams, the Baltimore Ravens and the Denver Broncos, but he didn't get much playing time. He could see the writing on the wall. He wasn't going to make it in the NFL. So he left for Europe to play in the European Football League. But when that career also began to sputter out around 2009, he came back to the United States and joined a very small-time indoor arena football league. Cullen's passion for the game was still as strong as ever, but he knew that playing at this level meant his career was effectively over. Around the same time he was hanging up his football cleats for good, he met a woman named Jennifer who would become his wife. She was an all-state volleyball player, and in many ways, she was just as competitive and athletic as Cullen. They were a perfect match. They got married in 2010, and Cullen, this big, tough quarterback, was shaking and crying at the altar. He was so nervous and excited about marrying Jennifer. It was a huge turning point for him, a moment where he was consciously putting his football past behind him to start a new life and build a family. The newlyweds moved into a house in Michigan, had 2 children, and Cullen landed a good job in medical sales. By all accounts, Cullen was thriving in his life after football. On Memorial Day weekend in 2013, Jennifer's family planned a 3-day fishing trip along the Baldwin River in Michigan. Cullen and Jennifer decided to join them with their kids. They rented a cabin near the campsite where Jennifer's family was staying. The whole weekend was wonderful. The weather was perfect, everyone was having a great time fishing and relaxing. On May 26th, the last night of the trip, Cullen, who had recently bought a new pontoon boat that he was incredibly proud of, wanted to go out one last time. He just wanted to fish for another 30 or 45 minutes before they packed up and ended the weekend. So Cullen put on his fishing waders and his jacket, grabbed his fishing pole, and had his family drive him to the set of stairs that led down to the water where his boat was docked. Before he walked down the steps, he turned and told his family he'd be out for about 30 to 45 minutes. He told them to pick him up at the next boat ramp downriver and that he would call them when he was ready. 42 minutes later, at 9:27 p.m., Jennifer's phone rang. It was Cullen. She expected him to say he was ready to be picked up. But when she answered, Cullen's voice was frantic. He told her that he was being followed by 2 men. He said he was out on the water in his pontoon boat, but there were 2 men in the tree line on the shore. He said he couldn't see them, but he could hear them, and they had been following him for some time. Before Jennifer could even process what he was saying and ask a question, Cullen said something incredibly strange. He told her he was going to beach the boat and take his clothes off. Then he hung up. Jennifer immediately tried calling him back over and over, but he didn't pick up. She was left feeling totally shocked and confused. What stood out most to her was the raw fear in his voice. Fear was not an emotion she associated with Cullen. This was a man who was a beast on the football field, who seemed fearless. For him to sound that scared and to be talking about people stalking him, she knew he was in serious trouble. She immediately called 911, described where he was on the Baldwin River, and the police said they would send someone out right away. After getting off the phone with the police, Jennifer called her family and told them about the bizarre and terrifying phone call from Cullen. Her brother, Matt, decided to try calling Cullen himself. This time, Cullen answered. Matt asked him, "Cullen, where are you?" Cullen replied, "I don't know where I am, but there's these 2 guys that are still following me." Matt tried to get more information, asking if he was still on his boat or if he was on land. All Cullen said was, "It's getting pretty rough out here," and then he hung up again. Matt called Jennifer and told her about the call, but it didn't provide any clarity. So Jennifer and her family decided the best thing to do was to drive to the boat ramp where Cullen had originally said he wanted to be picked up. They hoped he might somehow make his way there. When they arrived, Cullen was nowhere to be seen. They got out of their car and yelled his name into the darkness, but there was no response. Shortly after, a police car pulled up. This was one of the locations Jennifer had mentioned to the 911 operator. The police officer took an official statement from Jennifer, and at that point they filed an official missing person report for Cullen Finnerty. Before starting the physical search, the police contacted Cullen's wireless service provider and asked them to ping his cell phone. A service provider can roughly triangulate a phone's location based on which cell towers it's connecting to. The results they got back were bizarre. The last 4 locations that were pinged for Cullen's phone were up to 4 miles apart from each other. This was strange because the idea that Cullen could have covered that much ground, moving 4, 5, or even 7 miles in a short amount of time through very rugged wooded terrain, didn't seem possible. What was even stranger was that when police looked at these 4 points on a map, each one was either right next to a paved road or would have required him to cross a paved road to get there. If he was lost and scared, why would he keep crossing roads, which represented safety, and plunging back into the wilderness? As strange as the data was, it gave the police a solid starting point. They dispatched search teams to each of the 4 locations and also began combing the banks of the river where he was last seen. Within an hour, they found his boat. It was beached on the side of the river, a little ways downstream from where he had been dropped off. It was missing an oar. It wasn't clear if it had been intentionally beached or had just drifted ashore. Cullen was not in it, and a search of the immediate area found no sign of him. Interestingly, a man who owned property near where the boat was found told police he heard screaming or yelling coming from that area around the same time Cullen went missing. For the next 48 hours, police and hundreds of volunteers searched the areas where his phone had pinged and along the river, but there was no sign of him. Then, on the evening of May 28th, approximately 48 hours after he went missing, they found his body. He was located less than half a mile from a paved road in an area situated between the 4 cell phone ping locations. He was lying face down, his right arm tucked under his body and his left arm over his head, clutching a handful of grass. When they rolled him over, he had some blood coming from his nose, but other than that, there was no sign of significant trauma anywhere on his body. He appeared to be fully clothed, but investigators noted that the strap on his waders was badly twisted. This was a significant detail. A twisted strap like that would have been very uncomfortable, something a person would almost certainly fix before starting a fishing trip. This, combined with the bizarre statement he made to his wife about taking his clothes off, led some to speculate that at some point during his ordeal, his clothes had come off and had been put back on again in a hurry, either by him or by someone else. His cell phone was found in his front pocket. Cullen's initial autopsy was inconclusive. There was no obvious cause of death. Later, a more detailed analysis determined he had died of pneumonia caused by inhaling his own vomit. Many people believe Cullen's death was a tragic result of CTE, a brain injury caused by the years of repeated head trauma from playing football. CTE can lead to paranoia and confusion. Perhaps he had a severe paranoid episode, believed someone was chasing him, got lost and scared, and in his panicked state, somehow ended up dying. There was a minor incident in 2011 where Cullen had briefly thought someone was following him, but it had passed. But even if it was a fit of paranoia, why didn't he stop when he reached the paved roads? A road represents help and safety. His instinct should have been to seek help, not to run back into the woods. And why did he leave the safety of his boat in the first place? On the other hand, if he really was being followed, why would his pursuers allow him to make phone calls? Why would they prompt him to take his clothes off? It makes no sense. Both theories are full of holes, leaving a tragic and profound mystery. Thank you so much for watching. What makes stories like these so unsettling is that they don't feel impossible. Even today, people still disappear in forests, national parks, and remote wilderness areas under circumstances nobody can fully explain. And in all 3 of these cases, the victims described the exact same terrifying feeling that something was following them just beyond the trees. Maybe it was paranoia. Maybe it was exhaustion. Or maybe out in places where there are no cameras, no witnesses, and no help for miles around, there really was someone or something out there with them. Let me know what you think in the comments. And the next time you find yourself completely alone in the woods and suddenly get the feeling that you're being watched, you might want to trust that feeling. In the brisk chill of early 1986, the campus of the University of Missouri was filled with the anxious, excited energy of graduating seniors. Among them walked William, a 22-year-old young man who, on paper, had a perfectly mapped-out future. He was a journalism major, just a few months away from earning his degree from one of the most prestigious journalism schools in the country. A degree from this institution was a golden ticket to a stable career, but William was deeply unhappy. He realized he had absolutely no passion for news reporting, and the thought of spending his life in a traditional newsroom left him feeling empty. His true passion lay in Hollywood movies. Having lived in Missouri his entire life, William considered himself a sheltered kid who had never traveled far from home. To him, the local movie theater was a magical portal. It transported him to exotic lands, introduced him to fascinating characters, and showed him a world far bigger than his Midwestern surroundings. As graduation loomed, William faced a stark truth. If he didn't make a move now, he would spend his life living someone else's dream. Weeks before receiving his degree, he shocked everyone by dropping out of college, packing his bags into a beat-up car, and driving straight to Los Angeles to become an actor. When he arrived in Hollywood, his naive optimism was instantly met with a harsh reality. William quickly discovered that the streets of Los Angeles were overflowing with thousands of young, attractive, and ambitious people who shared his exact dream. The competition was brutal, with hundreds of actors lining up for even the smallest roles. However, his Midwestern work ethic kept him going. He found a talent agent and began auditioning constantly, willing to take any part, whether it was a low-budget horror film or a simple commercial, just to get in front of a camera. Yet, the industry remained indifferent, and he faced rejection after rejection. While he had the mental strength to handle the rejection, he could not escape his financial reality. Los Angeles was expensive, and his savings were rapidly disappearing. Because he needed to keep his daytime hours open for sudden auditions, he could only take side gigs that operated late at night or early in the morning. Since the city's struggling actors had already taken all the decent part-time jobs, William was left with the bottom-of-the-barrel work that nobody else wanted. To survive, he took two incredibly bizarre jobs. During the day, he worked for a fast food restaurant called El Pollo Loco. His job was to wear a massive, suffocatingly hot yellow chicken suit, stand out on the scorching pavement of Sunset Boulevard, and wave at traffic to lure in customers. It was exhausting and humiliating work. When the sun went down, he transitioned to his night job as a limousine driver for a group of exotic dancers who performed at private bachelor parties. He wasn't just a driver. He also had to enter the venues to act as their bodyguard, manage the music as a mobile DJ, and eventually clean up the cash and scattered clothing left behind before driving the exhausted dancers home at dawn. Initially, William accepted this chaotic life as a temporary rite of passage. But as the months dragged on, the struggling artist romanticism faded. The big break wasn't happening, and the low pay forced him to work grueling hours just to survive, leaving him little time to rehearse or rest. Caught in a miserable cycle of exhaustion and constant rejection, he reached a breaking point. William decided to quit the limousine job, keep the chicken suit gig for stability, and give himself one final, concentrated push. If things didn't change soon, he would pack up his car and move back to Missouri. On his final night driving the limousine, William struck up a conversation with one of the dancers. Like him, she was an aspiring actress using stripping to fund her dream. When William explained that he was simply going to as many open auditions as possible, she told him he was doing it wrong. She recommended a highly exclusive, prestigious acting class in the city where top talent scouts frequently went to look for new faces. She urged him to stop just auditioning and start training. Though William initially dismissed the idea, thinking he didn't have time for theory, he looked at his long streak of failures and decided he had nothing to lose. He agreed to attend just one session. A few days later, William walked into the acting studio. The instructor began pairing students up randomly to perform scenes live in front of the class. When William's name was called, he was paired with another young actor. However, the stakes for this particular scene were incredibly high. The other actor had invited major Hollywood talent agents to this specific class to watch him perform, hoping to get signed. William understood that he was only there to play a supporting role and read lines so his classmate could shine. He felt no pressure and was content to just help out. The two actors stepped onto the stage under the spotlight. The other actor delivered his lines exactly as rehearsed. But when it was William's turn to respond, something inside him shifted. All the months of frustration, the humiliation of the chicken suit, the late nights in the limousine, and the pain of 100 rejections broke through his quiet exterior. He didn't just read the script, he completely lived it. William's performance was electric. He delivered his lines with a raw, magnetic vulnerability and an emotional intensity that completely captivated the room. The spotlight instantly shifted. William didn't just support his partner, he completely overshadowed him. He brought a rare, natural charisma to the stage that commanded absolute attention. When the scene ended, the room was dead silent before bursting into thunderous applause. The talent agents ignored the actor they had originally come to see, walked straight up to William, and signed him on the spot. Word quickly spread through Hollywood about the incredibly talented unknown actor from Missouri who had stolen the spotlight in a high-stakes showcase. The momentum was unstoppable. William took off the chicken suit for good and never had to drive a limousine again. He began booking roles left and right, quickly rising from small parts to leading roles in massive global blockbusters. Today, the world no longer calls him William. Instead, he is known globally by his middle name, an international cinema icon, Academy Award winner, and one of the most celebrated movie stars to ever live, Brad Pitt. And the early fragile days of April 1945. The small town of Velp in the German-occupied Netherlands was locked in a state of suspended animation. The air was heavy, with the smell of smoke, damp earth, and the unmistakable, lingering scent of fear. Inside the cramped, shadow-filled basement of a modest brick house belonging to her aunt, a 15-year-old girl named Ada lay curled on a makeshift pile of faded wool blankets. Her stomach did not just rumble, it burned with a deep, gnawing agony that felt as though her body was slowly consuming itself from the inside out. Ada felt a profound, heavy weakness in her limbs, a lethargy so absolute that even shifting her weight across the floor required a monumental effort of will. She was quite literally standing on the precipice of starvation. At 5 feet 6 inches tall, a height that should have belonged to a developing, energetic young woman, Ada's weight had plummeted to a terrifying 88 pounds. Her collarbones protruded like sharp ridges beneath her threadbare clothes. Her skin was a translucent, sickly gray, and her eyes were sunken deep into her skull. She could no longer walk. She could no longer stand. When she tried to look at her mother, who sat silently in the dim light nearby, Ada found she could barely summon the strength to articulate basic words. Her voice had degraded to a dry, raspy whisper. To anyone looking at her, the reality was brutally clear. Without a miracle, the young girl was within a few days, perhaps even hours, of dying. The tragedy of the situation was compounded by the fact that she was not alone in her suffering. Surrounding her in the damp basement were her mother, her aunt, and a desperate group of refugees whom her family had bravely taken in. They sat shoulder to shoulder in the dark, their faces hollow, their own bodies wasting away. They watched Etta fade with breaking hearts, yet there was absolutely nothing they could do. There was no secret stash of bread, no hidden sack of potatoes, and no medicine to soothe her failing organs. The entire household, like millions of others across the Netherlands, had run out of food weeks ago. To make this nightmare even more unbearable, the basement was not just a shelter from hunger, it was a prison. Ada, her family, and the refugees had been completely trapped beneath the floorboards for months. Stepping outside into the daylight was not an option. It was an automatic death sentence. Outside, the closing chapters of World War II were raging across the Dutch countryside with apocalyptic fury. The town of Velp had become a chaotic battleground as the retreating Nazi forces clashed with the advancing Allied armies. Day and night, the ground above the basement trembled. Artillery shells screamed through the air, bombs shattered nearby homes into rivers of brick and dust, and the sharp, rhythmic crackle of machine gun fire echoed down the streets. To venture out in search of a stray turnip or a cup of clean water meant risking a stray bullet or being obliterated by falling debris. They were entirely cornered, caught between the invisible specter of starvation inside and the violent inferno outside. It had not always been this way. 5 years earlier, before the darkness of the war completely swallowed her world, the Netherlands had been a place of color and music for Ada. When the Nazi regime first invaded and occupied her homeland in 1940, she had been a vibrant, joyful 11-year-old girl. She was blessed with an abundance of natural grace and possessed a singular burning dream. She wanted to become a professional, world-class ballet dancer. She lived for the stage, spending hours practicing her postures, her leaps and her turns. Because she was so young when the gray uniformed soldiers first marched into her town, she didn't fully comprehend the geopolitical catastrophe unfolding around her. To a child, the occupation was an uncomfortable nuisance, a shadow that dimmed the lights but hadn't yet destroyed the house. That childhood innocence shattered completely when the reality of Nazi brutality struck her own family. Ada's uncle was a prominent, highly respected Dutch count and an outspoken anti-Nazi activist. He refused to sit idly by while his country was subjugated. Eventually, his underground activities were discovered by the Gestapo. He was arrested, imprisoned, and, without a fair trial, executed by a Nazi firing squad. The murder of her beloved uncle acted as a profound catalyst for Ada. The grief twisted into a fierce, unyielding determination. She looked at the world around her with newly opened eyes and realized that she could not remain a passive bystander while an oppressive regime tore her country apart. Despite her youth, she chose to fight back. Ada threw herself into the dangerous, secretive world of the Dutch resistance. She realized that her training as a ballerina could be used as a weapon against the occupiers. She began performing in covert underground ballet recitals held in darkened basements and hidden rooms across the region. These events, known as blackout performances, were strictly illegal. The audiences sat in absolute silence, never clapping for fear of alerting the German patrols patrolling the streets outside. The money raised from these hushed recitals was funneled directly into the resistance movement to forge documents, buy supplies, and finance underground operations. But Ada did not stop at dancing. Her innocent, youthful appearance made her the perfect courier. She routinely volunteered to smuggle illegal resistance newspapers, tightly folding the forbidden print and hiding it inside her ballet slippers or the linings of her coats. She rode her bicycle across town, navigating past German checkpoints with a calm, smiling demeanor that masked a racing heart. She knew that if a single soldier decided to search her bags, she would be executed on the spot. As the war intensified, her defiance grew. She successfully convinced her mother and aunt to convert their home into a safe house, taking in and concealing Jewish refugees and downed Allied pilots, hiding them beneath the very floorboards where she now lay dying. Every day was a high-stakes game of survival, but it gave Ada an intense sense of purpose. She was no longer just a helpless girl caught in a war, she was a participant, actively striking blows against tyranny. Then came the catastrophic winter of 1944. Following a major Allied airborne operation known as Market Garden, the Dutch railway workers went on strike to cripple the German military's movements. In a fit of cruel retaliation, the Nazi administration completely blocked all food and fuel transports into the western and northern parts of the Netherlands. This triggered what would forever be remembered as the Hunger Winter. Virtually overnight, supply lines died. A nation was cut off from the world. As the temperatures plummeted below freezing, millions of Dutch citizens found themselves without electricity, running water, heat, or food. People resorted to eating tulip bulbs and boiling grass just to trick their stomachs into feeling full. As the months wore on, the humanitarian crisis deepened into a catastrophe. For Ada, the physical toll was devastating. The intense physical exertion of her resistance work, combined with a total lack of nutrition, caused her health to fracture. Her body, already pushed to its absolute limits, began to shut down. The vibrant ballerina who used to leap effortlessly across stages became too weak to carry a newspaper. Her resistance work came to an abrupt, forced end. She could no longer fight. She could no longer aid the refugees. All she could do was retreat into the dark safety of the basement, lie down on the cold floor, and watch her own body waste away to skin and bone. On that particular fateful day in early April 1945, the noise above the basement reached a terrifying crescendo. Ada lay in the dark, her chest rising and falling in shallow, ragged gasps. The air was thick with dust shaken loose from the ceiling by the constant vibrations of war. The symphony of destruction outside was deafening, the roar of low-flying fighter planes, the sharp thud of anti-aircraft guns, and the wailing of air raid sirens. It felt as though the entire world above them was being ground into dust. In her extreme weakness, feeling the icy pull of death creeping into her fingers, Ada closed her eyes and offered a silent, desperate prayer to God for help, for food, for an end to the madness. The immediate response to her prayer was a terrifying, high-pitched whistling sound that cut through the ambient roar of the battle. It was a sound that everyone in wartime Europe knew and feared. It was the sound of a falling bomb, and it was coming straight for them. Before anyone in the basement could scream, a deafening blast shattered the atmosphere. The impact was monumental. The floor beneath them violently bucked, throwing debris into the air. Concrete cracked, the remaining glass windows upstairs shattered into 1,000,000 lethal shards, and a choking cloud of black smoke and plaster dust enveloped the room. The shockwave tore through Ada's frail body, and within seconds, the world dissolved into total, silent blackness. Sometime later, hours, perhaps even days, for time loses all meaning in the dark, Ada slowly regained consciousness. She coughed weakly, her throat choked with fine white plaster dust. Her ears were ringing with a loud, piercing static. As the dust slowly settled and her vision cleared in the dim light, she looked around, fully expecting to see a scene of carnage. But as she took inventory of the dark space, she witnessed an absolute miracle. Despite the bomb scoring an incredibly close, near-direct hit on the house above, the ancient stone foundations of the basement's structural integrity had somehow held. The heavy wooden beams had groaned and cracked, but they had not collapsed. She looked at her mother, her aunt, and the refugees. They were covered in white dust, bruised and terrified, but they were all alive. Yet, Ada did not feel a rush of relief. Instead, a profound sense of despair washed over her. She knew that surviving the blast was only a temporary reprieve. The house above them was likely ruined. They were still starving, she was still too weak to move, and the German soldiers were likely closing in. She believed this explosion was simply the beginning of the end. However, as she lay there, waiting for the next bomb to fall, she noticed something highly unusual. For months, the background track of her life had been an unbroken wall of noise, guns, engines, screams, and explosions. But right now, as she listened intently, the world was completely devoid of sound. The silence was heavy, profound, and absolute. There were no planes overhead. There were no artillery shells shaking the earth. There was no gunfire echoing down the cobblestone streets. The violent storm that had raged for years had suddenly, inexplicably, vanished. An uneasy, confused quiet fell over the refugees and her family. They exchanged panicked, uncomprehending glances. Was this a trap? Was the enemy waiting outside? Eventually, the agonizing silence pushed them to action. Driven by a desperate need to know what had happened, Ida's mother walked over to her daughter. Gathering her own remaining strength, she carefully lifted Ida's frail 88-pound frame into her arms, cradling her like a child. Together, the small group of survivors slowly walked up the debris-strewn basement stairs and stepped out into the open air for the first time in months. When their eyes adjusted to the bright morning sunlight, the sight that met them was overwhelming. The streets of Velp were not filled with gray Nazi uniforms. Instead, they were lined with British and Canadian Allied soldiers, their tanks and military trucks painted with white stars. The local Dutch townspeople, who had been hiding in their own cellars, were pouring out into the thoroughfares. People were weeping openly, falling to their knees, throwing their arms around the soldiers and waving red, white, and blue Dutch flags that had been hidden away for 5 long years. Voices shouted through the streets, carrying a single beautiful realization. It's over. We are free! Allied soldiers had successfully liberated the city. The German occupation was broken. As Ada watched the celebration from her mother's arms, the timing of it all struck her with immense weight. If that Allied bomb had struck just a few feet to the left, her family would have been crushed. If the war had dragged on for just 48 hours longer, her malnourished body would have given up, and she would have died a nameless casualty in that dark cellar. Against all mathematical odds, she had survived to see the dawn of freedom. Within weeks of Velp's liberation, the Allied forces systematically dismantled the remaining Nazi strongholds across Europe. Germany surrendered, and World War II came to an official end. The world began the long, painful process of healing, and so did Ada. The physical scars of the war, however, ran deep. Although she was slowly nursed back to health with the help of international relief organizations, the prolonged period of severe starvation and the injuries she sustained during the occupation had done permanent damage to her body. Her respiratory system was compromised, and her muscle development had been severely disrupted during crucial years of growth. When she finally returned to the dance studio, she had to face a heartbreaking reality. Her body could no longer handle the extreme, punishing demands of a professional, full-time prima ballerina. Her childhood dream was dead. But the spirit that had carried her through the Dutch resistance refused to be crushed. Realizing that one path was closed, she pivoted with grace. She began taking jobs as a fashion model to support her family, her striking aristocratic features and slender frame catching the eyes of photographers. Soon after, she tried her hand at acting, finding that the intense discipline, emotional depth, and poise she had developed during the terrifying years of the war translated beautifully to the stage and screen. She eventually left Europe behind and moved to the United States, targeting the heart of the entertainment world, Hollywood. In 1953, a mere 8 years after she had been a starving, skeletal 15-year-old girl waiting for death in a dusty Dutch basement, she was cast as the lead actress in a romantic comedy called Roman Holiday. Playing opposite Gregory Peck, her performance captured the hearts of audiences worldwide. She exuded a rare, luminous charm, a quiet strength, and an unmistakable elegance that set her completely apart from the typical Hollywood stars of the era. The film was a triumph, and for her very first major role, she won the Academy Award for Best Actress. The horrors of World War II had taken an immense toll on her life. It had stolen her uncle, threatened her family, and destroyed her ultimate dream of ballet. Yet, the brutal crucible of the war had also gifted her with a profound empathy, an unbreakable resilience, and a deep appreciation for the fragility of human life. These qualities not only made her one of the most successful, iconic, and revered actresses in the history of cinema, but they also guided her later years, during which she stepped away from the cameras to travel the world as a deeply dedicated UNICEF Goodwill Ambassador, fighting to save starving children in war-torn regions just as she had been saved. When she achieved global fame, she chose to leave her childhood nickname Ada in the past. Instead, the world came to know her by the name that remains synonymous with grace, timeless beauty, and humanitarian devotion, Audrey Hepburn. On a humid morning in the summer of 1889, a 36-year-old surgeon named Dr. William Halstead stood in an operating prep room at the Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore, Maryland. Standing beside him was his 27-year-old head nurse, Caroline Hampton. They were preparing for an upcoming surgery, but before Dr. Halstead would even think about picking up a scalpel, he had to watch Caroline complete a grueling ritual. Caroline stood before a row of porcelain sinks filled with various liquids. First, she scrubbed her hands and forearms with scalding hot water and heavy-duty antibacterial soap. Next, she used harsh brushes and metal files to clean beneath her fingernails. Then came the painful part. She dipped her bare hands directly into a bowl of harsh acid, followed by a 5-minute soak in a highly corrosive chemical solution called mercury bichloride. Dr. Halstead ran a remarkably tight ship, especially when it came to hand hygiene. Today, we know that washing our hands before medical procedures is common sense, but in 1889, it was a radical and highly controversial concept. At the time, germ theory, the idea that microscopic organisms cause diseases and infections, was brand new. Most doctors flatly rejected it. Surgeons would routinely walk from an autopsy room straight into a delivery room without washing their hands or cleaning their tools, completely unaware that they were carrying deadly bacteria to their patients. Dr. Halstead, however, was a firm believer in germ theory. He was obsessed with cleanliness, which is why he created this brutal multi-step scrubbing routine for his surgical team. While other hospitals across the United States suffered from terrifyingly high post-surgery infection rates, Dr. Halstead's department boasted some of the lowest mortality rates in the country. His methods worked beautifully, but they came at a severe physical cost to his staff. The chemicals they used were toxic, eating away at human skin day after day. On this particular morning, as Dr. Halstead watched Caroline let her hands air dry, he noticed just how badly she was hurting. Her hands and forearms were covered in angry red blisters, raw rashes, and painful cracked skin. It was a terrible sight, and Dr. Halstead felt a deep pang of guilt. He felt guilty for two reasons. First, Caroline was an incredible worker. Despite the immense pain the daily chemical baths caused her, she never once complained. She followed his strict rules flawlessly, which was exactly why he had promoted her to head nurse. She possessed an iron will and a profound dedication to her job. But the second, much deeper reason for his guilt was a secret he kept buried in his heart. Dr. Halstead was madly in love with Caroline. He had never told her how he felt. He believed he was too old for her, and he assumed a brilliant, capable woman like Caroline would never be interested in a serious, work-obsessed surgeon like himself. So he loved her from afar, keeping his feelings strictly professional while remaining intensely protective of her. Watching the woman he secretly adored destroy her skin every day just to satisfy his protocols was tearing him apart. For the first time, Dr. Halstead began to question his own system. He desperately wanted to tell Caroline that she could skip the chemical scrub to let her hands heal, but he was trapped by his own reputation. He was the leading champion of germ theory in America. If he made a special exception for his head nurse, word would spread, his credibility would be ruined, and his staff would stop taking the hygiene rules seriously. He needed a workaround, a solution that would protect Caroline's hands without compromising the sterile environment of his operating room. Months passed, and as the calendar turned to early 1890, Dr. Halstead sat alone in his office. On his desk lay a small, neatly wrapped package that had just arrived. He looked at it with a mixture of nervous anticipation and intense hope. For nearly a year, he had been trying to solve his dilemma. Finally, he had come up with an out-of-the-box idea and reached out to the Goodyear Rubber Company to see if they could manufacture a highly specific prototype. Dr. Halstead tore open the package. Inside were two strange, thin, flexible objects made of dark, vulcanized rubber. Without wasting a single second, he grabbed them, hurried out of his office, and marched down the hallway to the operating prep room. As expected, he found Caroline standing by the sinks, lifting her raw, blistered hands to begin the agonizing scrubbing process. Dr. Halstead stepped forward and gently stopped her. He held out the two rubber objects and told her to put them on instead of dipping her hands into the chemicals. Caroline looked at the strange items, looked at her bleeding hands, and with a confused but trusting nod, pulled them over her fingers. Within just 1 week, the results were undeniable. Because the rubber acted as an impenetrable barrier, Caroline no longer had to plunge her bare skin into corrosive acids. Her hands and forearms healed beautifully, returning to their natural, healthy state. Seeing Caroline out of pain gave Dr. Halstead a massive surge of confidence. The joy of seeing her heal finally gave him the courage to break his silence. He confessed his deep love to Caroline, and to his absolute amazement, she revealed that she had been secretly in love with him too. Not long after, Dr. Halstead asked for her hand in marriage, and she happily said yes. While their love story was beautiful, it was the clever workaround Dr. Halstead invented out of love that would echo through history. Initially, he had only commissioned those rubber coverings to protect his fiancée's skin. But very quickly, Doctor. Halstead and the rest of the Johns Hopkins medical team noticed a fascinating side effect. The patients Caroline operated on had even fewer post-surgery infections than before. The medical community realized that these rubber barriers didn't just protect the nurse's skin from chemicals, they also protected the patient from any stray germs remaining on a human hand. Soon, every surgeon, nurse, and doctor across the globe adopted the practice. Because a brilliant doctor fell deeply in love with his head nurse, he inadvertently created one of the most widely used and life-saving medical tools in human history, the world's very first pair of rubber surgical gloves. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya.